This is a 4-hour debate. So in order for me to lock in, I will be playing Madden at the same time. I apologize. No, I don't. I don't give a fuck. All right, go.
Thank you for the $2.
Oh, sorry, he's here. Welcome to the show. We have an audible connection now. So let's just get this on the road and we'll get to it. So
Can't wait until Madden
welcome.
26
Yet
comes
another episode of WIC TV. It's a cross-ideological space where we come together to talk about issues both political and cultural, from the silly to the serious. Econoboi asked me to set this up because he felt that it would be a more productive discussion to have kind of like a more
correction already, moderator interference. The people asked for this to be set up. The people did.
The people. Okay. So the socialism strikes already. Okay, well, voice of the people, Econoboi, why don't we do this? We're just debating on capitalism and socialism today. And the first question I have for Econoboi, and we're going to give the mic to him, is when you say you're a socialist, what do you mean? Go ahead.
Yeah, I thought we were doing opening statements.
Yeah, this is your opening statement. Go ahead.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
Sure. Okay. Yeah, so I think there's a lot of misunderstandings about my position, so I figured doing this discussion directly would I don't know, help clear some of that up at the very least. I know a lot of people don't fucking listen, okay? So hopefully they will today. To answer that question right off the bat, socialism is when you collectively own the means of production. And by the means of production, that's basically businesses. I think that's what socialism is. That's the broadest kind of tent of socialism that I think is the biggest through line of socialist thinkers. And I guess to go on with my opening statement, even though it was phrased as a question, why is this preferable to capitalism? So I fundamentally now describe myself as a socialist because I came to a developed egalitarian view where egalitarianism is something that I think is intrinsically valuable for a number of reasons. We can relate to each other as equals. I think that's a good thing, morally speaking. I think that the distributional principle of essentially equal access to advantage, where advantage is welfare and resources.
In terms are valuable. When I do stream, like when I do recordings, I'm really just there to do my commentary and get out of there. For like streams, I am dedicating myself to a large portion of time to really understand what is going on. So it's always good to I guess fact check, but I offer another like level of understanding, because sometimes when these political conversations are happening, it assumes a level of understanding for the people, and that's why I do like certain breakdowns. I did a breakdown in terms of like people's misunderstanding of socialism on my channel. I'm gonna plug myself on my own content. Shout out. I threw an interception. I am trash, but so I did this video. I do recommend people to watch it. And the video is a breakdown on socialism. Share this tab. It's this one right here. Socialism, America's next big move, or a dangerous whatever. I also did a video about the red pill being a scam 2 years ago. Man, I cooked on that video too. Jesus Christ, I'm like cooking. But this video, feel free to go watch it. It just breaks down people's misconceptions about socialism, right? But here's a definition on socialism. Socialism, shout out Britannica. Social and economic doctrine that calls for public rather than private ownership or control of property and natural resources. According to the socialist view, individuals do not live or work in isolation, but live in cooperation with one another. Furthermore, everything people produce is in some sense a social product. Everyone who contributes to the production of goods is entitled to share in it. Society as a whole, therefore, should own or at least control property for the benefit of all its members. And then this conviction puts socialism in opposition to capitalism, which is based on private ownership of the means of production and allows individual choices in a free market to determine how goods and services are distributed. Socialists complain that capitalism necessarily leads to unfair and exploitative concentrations of wealth and power in the hands of the relative few who emerge victorious from free market competition. People would then use their wealth and power to reinforce their dominance in society. And there's like more to it. I'm sure you guys can do your own studying, or you can watch my video about it. But the biggest thing, the biggest worry when it comes down to socialism at the end of the day is that it allows the opportunity to take advantage of society. That's the biggest thing. There's risk in terms of, like, I guess, effort when a socialism system is put into place, where people are worried that it is not as competitive as a free market economy because of that, self-ownership and that collective ownership. There's more competition in free market society, which allows, more boom in terms of the economy, as well as there's the opportunity to someone to come in and take advantage and, consolidate the power that they have in terms of the system, because in order to enforce it, you would need more consolidated power within a government, and the person who enforces these rules with this amount of power over these corporations could then, eventually become an authoritarian society. So there is a lot of downsides on its total implementation, but if it's partially implemented, I think that is probably what they're going to explore in this conversation.
Is established by G.A. Cohen. I think those are sensible egalitarian views as well. And capitalism kind of violates this in a number of ways. It violates it because of the private ownership of the means of production, sort of unequally distributing wealth in society, right? And unequally distributed wealth means unequally distributed capital income. But it also means unequally distributed power in society, right? Wealthy people have a lot more power. They have a lot more, as Ryan Mullally would say, capacity, but I would just say freedom. And I think that that's probably not good, especially on balance of your other values. Essentially, if we can create a more equal society without destroying the economy or, destroying innovation or something like that, then I think that we should do it. And then maybe you'd sacrifice some level of like utility or something for some like radical increase in equality, perhaps. And so I think that that's just something that is important. I think that inequality itself needs a reason to exist, and our current unequal society just doesn't have a good enough reason, if you ask me. Now,
if you have a passion.
Sarwick,
to go on to finish out, I'll talk about my model very briefly. I think that the capital allocation, profit motive, like these kind of competitive processes are important. The way that capitalism kind of works today is that we have huge asset managers that allocate a huge proportion of the capital in society. And so basically what I'm saying is we should transition that process, that capital management asset process, from private hands to public hands in the form of sovereign wealth funds and holding corporations, to where we can eat up a large chunk of the economy, if not the whole economy, if things just end up working out really, really well by doing this. One small
all right. Oh, hello.
caveat before I, give it over to Wick and Destiny is when I reference countries, I've heard people say that I said this. I've never said this, and I won't say it today. I don't think that the Nordic countries are socialist countries. Okay, I think that socialism is when you collectively own the means of production.
He's correct. They are not socialist countries.
Societies exist on a spectrum between total private ownership and total collective ownership, the socialist ideal, the capitalist ideal. The Nordic economies, the reason I reference them is because they've engaged in a process of socializing at least a very large chunk of their economies. And we can see kind of the fruits of that, where they have reasonably decent levels.
There's going to be a lot of back and forth to really dissect this properly, because I'm not an economist by any means. And I'm not going to pretend that I know everything right off rip, right? There's a knowledge gap that he has because he's much more research in this than I do. So just general understanding is a good surface level to really engage in this conversation. So what is a sovereign wealth fund? I thought that was appropriate to look up because this is what he advocates for. And it did sound interesting. That's why I was never I'm willing to entertain some implementation of a socialist policy, but I'm not willing to entertain a socialist economy. A sovereign wealth fund is a state-owned investment fund comprised of money generated by the government, often derived from a country's surplus reserves. Sovereign wealth funds provide a benefit for a country's economy and its citizens. Sovereign wealth fund is a state-owned investment fund. Sovereign wealth funds can be derived from a variety of sources, blah, blah. The funding for a sovereign wealth fund can come from a variety of sources. Popular sources are surplus reserves from state-owned natural resource revenues. We always see like the surplus of. Oh, people don't really know that there tends to be surpluses in like the amount of money, and sometimes they use those surpluses to buy, like, to pay for fucking football stadiums that people don't realize. Trade surpluses, bank reserves that may accumulate from budgeting excesses, foreign currency operations, money from privatization, and governmental transfer payments. In general, sovereign wealth funds usually have a targeted purpose. Some countries have sovereign wealth funds that can be similar to venture capital for the private sector. Similar to any type of investment fund, sovereign wealth funds have their own objectives, terms, risk tolerance, liability matches, and liquidity concerns. Some funds may prefer returns over liquidity and vice versa, depending on the assets and objectives. Sovereign wealth fund risk management can range from conservative to a high tolerance for risk. Now, I won't go through all of it, but I guess my only thing is when it comes to a sovereign wealth fund is like who's going to be the individual or what entity is going to be the one in charge of it, right? I mean, technically, a group of people can kind of invest into these funds. Like, they're not prevented to do this, but a lot of these like firms or, you know, companies can bring about a large amount of money. So how is this going to be ran? I'm curious to see how he plays that, because if it's ran by the government, then we would see like what is the extent, how reliable would that be, et cetera, et cetera. Oh, switch back.
Examples of the process where I want to move society towards.
Okay, well, thanks for being here. Destiny, why is
good unionization, things like that, high equality, and I think that those are just good examples of the process where good unionization economies, and we can see kind of the fruits of that, where they have reasonably decent levels of economic growth, employment, good unionization, things like that, high equality, and I think that those are just good examples of the process where I want to move society towards.
Okay, well, thanks for being here. That's
ideal. The Nordic economy, the reason I reference them is because they've engaged in a process of socializing at least a very large chunk of their economies. And we can see kind of the fruits of that, where they have reasonably decent levels of economic growth, employment, good unionization, things like that, high equality. And I think that those are just good examples of the process where I want to move society towards.
Okay, well, thanks for being here. Destiny, why is capitalism the superior system to whatever Econoboi just said?
Because capitalism is based. I just want to start off by saying that I spent a lot of time on Amazon because I was going to respond to Econoboi's horrible appropriation of violent communist flags and other stuff in the background. I was going to buy a bunch of Nazi shit, and they don't actually sell Nazi flags on Amazon. So I don't appreciate that. I feel like it's very one-sided in how they run things over there. When it comes to like a larger discussion on this, I don't know if I need to clarify this or not, but I guess just for anybody listening who doesn't catch everything on every platform.
What he's referring to, because Destiny's always with the jokes, what he's referring to is that Econoboi dressed up like with like a bunch of communist paraphernalia, and I did a post that like Anna, if you guys are familiar with Destiny's Orbit, she criticized, saying that this is equivalent to like dressing up as a Nazi. And honestly, like when I saw that, I mean, I get the meme, I get the joke, but it does downplay in a very, very destructive, time in history. So it was kind of inappropriate. There is a level of equivalence to not like wearing a bunch of Nazi shit. So yeah,
obviously there were a lot of heated debates between me and Pisco and Econoboi and other members of different communities having to do with like leftists and tankies and bad actors and everything. Just to clarify for the 50 millionth time, I don't think Econoboi is a secret tanky. I don't think he's secretly trying to be subversive or doing things. I do disagree, I think, fundamentally with a lot of his platform, but not in the same way that I would say that like other like Marxist-Leninists are bad faith actors trying to worm their way into the system to destroy everything in a way that they're not upfront about. Just I guess for anybody that needs to hear that or isn't clear of that. So I guess our conversation will probably revolve around a few things in this debate or conversation, whatever we call this. So I think the first issue I have is I think there's like an unclear vision of what socialism actually is or means. I think it's kind of ironic, or not ironic, but funny, I guess, that Econoboi kind of started off clarifying, what his version of socialism is, that he doesn't think that Nordic countries are socialist. And it seems like that on one hand, you want to say, not Econoboi in general, but on one hand, like people want to say that they're socialist, but then you fight so much against like what socialism means or what it doesn't mean that the label starts to become meaningless. And I think that the issue is that it allows for a lot of bad faith actors to come in and kind of usurp that label.
So like I said in the intro, that this is going to be another part of the conversation in terms of the value of the term socialist. And I just don't see why Econoboi is so hell-bent on trying to trying to stick with the label, right? There, and I agree with Destiny. There's so many bad actors. Is there even a point to try to stick with the label, right? It's the similar to the idea of originally the term woke had a good definition, right? The term woke was like people who was under like an oppressive system, and then they like awoken from that system that there's more to society and human rights. It has been co-opted by the right mostly and turned into basically a negative term, and it is what it is. There's no reclaiming it at this point because it's an effective political strategy. That can be said the same way as socialism. The term socialist and socialism has been co-opted. Maybe if there was more good figures like Econoboi, then we could really have a serious conversation about it. But there isn't. There's just a lot of bad actors. There's a lot of people who are bad for the Democratic Party that use that term, and the entire MAGA and a lot of people in the center left also think that term is negative, as well as it having so much loaded history when it comes to our issues with the Soviet Union and Cuba. So it's just there's no value in calling yourself a socialist. I just don't see why he doesn't just use the term social democrat, because it still insinuates that you have issues that you care about in terms of the social concept, but you're still hell-bent on the principles of democracy and free market capitalism. Unless he completely wants to get rid of free market capitalism altogether, then I mean, I guess that's a different conversation.
And use it as kind of a disguise. Or so that's one reason I don't like the socialist label if what somebody's advocating for is largely liberal or works in a liberal or capitalist framework. I think that there are huge moral and democratic questions about what the expropriation of property ultimately looks like. A lot of the examples I think that Econoboi gives for how we could expropriate property, I think are a little bit unsatisfactory. So when we bring up things like civil asset forfeiture or things like eminent domain, like we're not taking these things to socialize them or to make them like a part of a socialist economy. Usually they're done for other reasons, sometimes for punishments for crimes or sometimes for necessary government projects. I don't think that those comparisons are the same as trying to acquire 90 to 100% of the overall capital of the United States, under the ownership of the government. I think that when we talk about egalitarianism and when we talk about idealized forms of economies, I don't know how much I'm going to argue this, but I think it's interesting that you always hear this argument, and even capitalists give here, arguments will, socialists will say, and capitalists will say, well, socialism only works in an idealized form of society where there's no human greed. And in an ideal world, maybe we'd be socialist. But I don't actually know why that's true. I feel like people assume that, and it's not necessarily the case. Like, I can envision an ideal socialist world where everybody shares in the means of production.
I think this is a good definition for all of us to be on the same page as well. Egalitarian, believing that all people are equally important and should have the same rights and opportunities in life. Very reasonable, understandable philosophy.
We all get the fruits of our own labor, and we all can do that, sure. But I could also conceive of an ideal capitalist world where everybody has really high-paying jobs. They can choose who they want to work for at any point in time and quit and leave. And I feel like you could have idealized versions of both worlds. It's just difficult because with capitalism, there's a real-world implementation of that, and you have to fight on that real-world implementation. And then on the socialist version, you have to fight on the kind of like idealized or utopian version. So it's harder to kind of like point out flaws. 4 and 5, I think, for the fourth point, I got socializing profits is a thing that socialists always talk.
Idealized version of capitalism. I agree with his implementation point. What does an idealized version of capitalism look like? I mean, it looks like, I guess there would be, but that would put a lot of onus in billionaires to trickle down the funds that they consolidate, and then maximize their resources for public good. It puts a lot of onus in terms of like a few individuals. And it does provide the opportunity, while also providing the opportunity to showcase that there is a means to have high-paying, fruitful, hard-driven careers that has a lot of like potential for success. Like, I think I'm starting to see what Destiny is referring to.
About like we want equal ownership in the means of production so that we can all kind of reap the rewards. And I think that's an attractive quality about sharing the ownership of the means of production, but it also means socializing decisions. And I feel like there's not as much time paid to the socializing decisions parts. So for instance, if the government owns 90 to 100% of all the capital in the country, that means that every new business started kind of has to be started by the government. So are we taking votes on that? Are they going to be picking winners and losers? Are they going to decide, whether or not there's an 18 or older ID verification limit on my pornographic consumption, or whether or not League of Legends gets canceled for Dota 2 or whatever else? And then I think that for the final thing, this is kind of a general complaint I've had. When people talk about like, oh, we got these really good things because of socialism in the United States, whether you're talking minimum wage or 40-hour work weeks or whatever else, I think it's important to clarify that all of these things are happening in a liberal system, and there are good things that can happen from lots of different modes of economic production and lots of different countries that can happen in a liberal capitalist system. But if we were to move to a fully socialist system, we could only do the good socialist things. You wouldn't have any of the good capitalist things, and I think that is problematic.
Okay, is that your goal, Econoboi, to move to a entirely socialist system?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's moral reasons to think that the socialist ideal of complete social ownership of businesses would be a good thing, right? That,
Did he say yeah as the filler word to transition into his next statement? Or did he say yeah to answer the question? Let me alone.
Again, if we could, and this is something that I've said before, I think a kind of a typical argument that people will make against socialism is, oh, well, it looks great on paper, which is to say, like, intuitively, sure, like a totally egalitarian system looks great, but it just doesn't work, right? We just can't make it work for one reason or another. And I would say that, look, I mean, I guess I don't know as we move through the process of like fully socializing the economy, exactly what it would look like when we start to get to 80, 85, 90% of businesses being collectively owned. But I think that there's strong reason to believe that we can at least get a great majority of the way there without these kind of huge deleterious effects on the economy. And at the end of the day, I'm not super stubborn about this. Like if we get to whatever, 75%, like we've replaced institutional private investors with institutional public investors, which is to say about 75% of the stock market and all this kind of stuff is owned publicly instead of privately. And all of a sudden, we have this kind of like radically egalitarian system compared to what we had before with similar standards of living. I guess I'm just not so offended by that, right? But in our current system where we have just such a high level of inequality, wealth inequality, income inequality, and what I think to be pretty obvious solutions towards fixing that problem in pretty direct ways, and we can look at other examples of countries that have done that, we should certainly do it, because I think that most people have at the very least egalitarian instincts, and so we should move toward that direction, even if once we get there, it's like, oh, we have to kind of make some sticky decisions on the edge. I think that the bigger discussion is, should we move towards that direction, and what does moving towards that direction look like? Because certainly I think that we should, and certainly I think that there's a good way to move towards that direction.
Can I ask a question on this? I'm trying to hone in when you say moral reasons. Okay. So my understanding is if you had a fully socialist society where all of the workers are owning all of their means of productions, that would basically do little, if anything, to address overall wealth inequality. No? Wouldn't you still have massive wealth inequality across different firms, even if not within different firms? So for instance, if there was like a cooperatively owned or socialist owned engineering firm, wouldn't all those people make way more money than the cooperatively owned janitorial cleaning services firm?
Yeah. So I think it's important to maybe take a step back. So there's a lot of different ways to collectively own the means of production. Worker ownership is just one of those ways. Now, I don't really favor a worker ownership model personally. I tend to favor social ownership models through things like expansion of government services, which you and I would agree that some government services should be expanded, like public transit, healthcare systems, things like that. And then I think that the bulk of the market economy should be owned by these kind of publicly owned holding corporations and sovereign wealth funds, which compete against each other similar to how current asset managers already do. And that would create a hugely egalitarian distribution, because public wealth is sort of necessarily horizontally distributed, because the way that wealth is managed is one person, one vote, not necessarily one worker in one cooperative, one vote. I hope that makes sense.
Okay, so then if, for instance, if there was like a...
I'm sorry, I'm going to have to replay that. I'm locked in with Madden about it in the first half, so I have to really lock in on what he's saying.
Cooperatively across different firms, even if not within different firms. So for instance, if there was like a cooperatively owned or socialist owned engineering firm, wouldn't all those people make way more money than the cooperatively owned janitorial cleaning services firm?
Yeah. So I think it's important to maybe take a step back. So there's a lot of different ways to collectively own the means of production. Worker ownership is just one of those ways. Now, I don't really favor a worker ownership model personally. I tend to favor social ownership models through things like expansion of government services, which you and I would agree that some government services should be expanded, like public transit, healthcare systems, things like that. And then I think that the bulk of the market economy should be owned by these kind of publicly owned holding corporations and sovereign wealth funds, which compete against each other similar to how current asset managers already do. And that would create a hugely egalitarian distribution because public wealth is sort of necessarily horizontally distributed because the way that that wealth is managed is one person, one vote, not necessarily one worker in one cooperative, one vote. I hope that makes sense. Managed is one person, one vote. Public wealth is sort of necessarily horizontally distributed because the way that that wealth is managed is one person, one vote, not necessarily one worker in one cooperative, one vote. I hope that makes sense.
Okay.
I'm gonna let this. I'm formulating my thoughts. I'm gonna let Destiny ask what he got, and I'm gonna see if I.
So then, we're saying that the businesses are collectively owned, meaning that employees could still like quit and go to other jobs or get education and training, go to other jobs. Does this mean that the government then would be basically collecting the excess in worker, like in the value produced by the worker? The government would basically be the stand-in for the capital owner there?
Well, I mean, even Marx in his Critique of the Gotha program said that the worker is not entitled to the entire surplus value that they create, that you need money to be set aside for things like administration, welfare payments, and I think he also said like essentially capital rotation, like reinvestments in capital, right? And so similarly, right, by having a social ownership model, we're essentially accomplishing all of those goals at once, where the worker is returned a substantial portion of the value that they create, because obviously workers still enjoy the fruits of the government's services and welfare payments and, UBI or whatever we use the capital income for. But it also goes to those other things that Marx identified as important as well, just general welfare payments for people who can't work. I think he identified the elderly and people like that as well. And of course, the government can also make public investments with that money as well.
Okay, so I'm trying to just understand. So like administration fees, I wouldn't consider this like capital owner, right? So when I think of capital, I think of, for a business, you're deploying you're deploying your capital, and then you're deploying your labor. And then when the labor interacts with the capital, the labor is creating some value. And then when that product is like sold to some consumer, some money goes back to the cost of the business, but there's an excess at the top after administrative fees, after everything else. And that excess at the top would go to the capital investor. And I'm just trying to understand. So in this state, you would have the capital investor, the capital owner, the owner class is just replaced by the state, right?
Yeah, the capital owners would be the public at large, right? So again, I think that Marx, obviously, a lot of in Marx's writings, he's a little bit vague. Obviously, he recommended.
Oh, yeah, are you saying that it would just go into like public goods? Is that what he's trying to say? But that, again, that puts a lot of onus on the government to utilize that fund like properly, right? I mean, we currently already have an issue where people think that the government misuses funds all the time, and the government super inefficient. That's why we have the whole situation with Doge. So do you think there's going to be enough? And this is something people don't really understand, is the way that Nordic model, why it's so effective, is that there's so much trust. And when it comes to institutions, you need a lot of trust and faith. There's so much trust into their government and what they are going to do, things that is in the best interest of the people. In this situation, it would require a lot of faith from the people, and right now we don't have that at all. A lot of people do not have faith in the government to do that appropriately. Like, if I were to ask Econoboi that in a situation where this system existed, would you have faith that MAGA is going to use those funds appropriately, that they are going to disseminate those resources properly to the public services that you're referring to? I guess that is the biggest question here, because it requires a lot of onus with the government and the way they handle themselves.
At some points in his life, he recommended state ownership, but it seemed like there was a cooperative ownership model maybe in the mature part of his life. At the end of the day, though, I'm just saying that, number one, I don't think that Marx is like a definitive view of what socialism is, but even to the extent that he is, I think that the spirit of this, where the worker receives a great portion of the value that they create, but set aside for the rest of society things like administrative expenses, capital investment, and welfare payments, I think that the spirit of that is accomplished with a social ownership model as well. And of course, to the extent that maybe some Marx historian would just say, no, Econoboi, you're totally wrong and misinterpreting Marx, it's like, well, whatever, my system's much more egalitarian, so that's why I prefer it.
Sure. So I'm not trying to figure out what Marx. I'm just trying for your personal, just so we can understand, I guess what I guess you would advocate for personally. So so then we're saying that okay, so just going back to understand. I don't know if Marx agrees or disagrees. Okay, you're replacing the capital owner of the business with the state, essentially, with the government, right?
Yeah, ultimately the state would be the owner of the shares in some complex system, but it's managed through these kind of holding corporations and sovereign wealth funds.
Okay. So the state has ownership, and then the management. Does the state, like, you don't have to be like hyper specific. I'm just trying to understand what the managing structure, I guess, would look like. So it's not the state making the decisions; it's the holding companies, or.
Yeah, so I think that these things should be kind of technocratically managed. You mentioned that people should really focus on that. kind of decision-making process. And that was a large part of what the third part of my Substack was about, is like, how do these capital allocation decisions get made, as inspired by this book that I read, The Public Wealth of Nations. And so essentially what I would recommend is that the way that the public should manage its wealth is it should be in these competing holding corporations, which are capitalized initially by the state in one way or another, however the state gets its money to capitalize the funds. These funds would then be managed by professional investment managers, kind of at arm's length from the state. You can think of it sort of like the Federal Reserve, right? Where the Federal Reserve is kind of this like quasi-independent private agency type situation, but it's more technocratically managed. Do that same kind of similar structure, but with all these different competing holding corporations that operate independently from each other, but are ultimately owned by the state. And then as they allocate that capital and the returns from that capital kind of trickle up to them, they would dividend out part of that to the state directly, and then they would use part of that to reinvest in other businesses and other entrepreneurial activity, similar to how private asset managers do today.
The how are they initially capitalized by the state? Like, how would a state decide? Like, oh, like there's 5 firms that do stuff. I guess. Yeah. How does that?
I recommend a path in the same Substack that I referenced. So there's 3 main ways. So number one is the state already owns, unbeknownst to it, a lot of public wealth. Dag Detter in the Public Wealth of Nations book, he estimates that basically because the state just has a really poor system of accounting, the state already owns about 1 times GDP worth of public assets. They just don't account for them properly. And so what a lot of states have done, both in relation to Dag Detter's work, but then in opposite to that, is they've just accounted for their current public assets and spun them off into these holding corporations to be managed entrepreneurially. The state just realizes, oh, we own a lot of real estate. Oh, we have all these SOEs that we don't really account for properly. We have all these kind of like state, kind of quasi-state service companies that we run. Let's put those into a commercial bucket, holding corporation. Professional investment managers allocate that capital, run it professionally. So that's one way. Another way is
the first thing, having wealth. So wealth, broadly speaking, can include things like capital. You can invest like capital. We're not talking money. Like, just because you might have like a state ownership of a bunch of utility companies or power plants, doesn't mean you can just invest that, because that's represented by like physical capital, not like just money, right?
Yeah. It's a mixture of things, right? So it's physical capital. The public at large, the most poorly accounted for assets in a public portfolio are typically real estate assets. Municipal buildings, rights of way, public lands, things like that. And so what you would do is you put all that capital into a single portfolio. This would be worth about $29 trillion. Some of those assets, like you said, wouldn't be commercial. They'd be like state parks or municipal buildings that are currently in use. It's like, well, we're not going to like use these for a for-profit purpose. But for all those assets that we now discover and that we would want to put.
Oh, hello. Is this me or him?
Got him.
15 or $14.5 trillion. Then you could take all of that. Oh, Wick, is everything okay?
Oh yeah, you froze for a minute and we were like,
okay.
Did I lose?
Okay, go ahead. You can take all of those real estate assets and then say, okay, well, let's just start developing them, right? And so part of that could be real estate development. It could be selling that off and investing in equities, just kind of generally building the wealth of society. That's just one way.
I'm just trying to understand this for the first thing, because I'm super confused. Okay. So it sounded like we were saying, so I'm trying to figure out like, how do you capitalize these initial public holding corporations? So like, where do they get their money from initially? And then it sounded like the answer was, well, there's actually a whole bunch of wealth that exists in the United States that's actually not accounted for right now, which I agree is actually a weird problem. We talk about GDP, but we don't actually know the nation's wealth. Like what is the total public accounting of all the assets? And then you say, well, there's a lot of these things that exist out there that aren't accounted for very well. And so we can have a better accounting of them. It's like, okay, but when we have that better accounting of them, we're not talking about money sitting in bank accounts. We're talking about, we're like the stuff that capital is allocated to that it buys. So like power plants or real estate or whatever.
Answer your question, they would be sold for money, or they would be developed directly, right?
How would they sell it? But if we're talking about a model where we're moving to public ownership of all these things, who are you selling it to?
Well, I mean, you have to transition from one system to another through some deliberative process, right? So currently they would be sold to like a bunch of different, private investors or other like state investors who would want to invest in those. Like, oh, we want to buy this real estate, we'll exchange it for cash. And then the holding corporation can take that cash and then do other development activities, invested in public equities, just do entrepreneurial investing and, balance sheet management, just like any of these other asset managers do. And then through that process, they would accumulate capital.
The examples that we're giving here, can you give me a couple examples of things that you would? That seems like a horrible idea. Hold on, I'm sorry. Like, I'm thinking like the things that the public owns. Like, are we selling national parks for cash to capitalize our new public holding firms? Or are we selling like Section 8 housing? Or are we selling like power plants?
I just said there are going to be some assets that are not commercial in nature. I even referenced national parks. Like you probably wouldn't, you wouldn't sell a national park for cash, but there's a lot of or abandoned buildings that the government owns that it doesn't use productively because the government just has a very poor system of accounting for those assets, right? And so to the extent that we have assets like that we think like, we're not using this basically for any productive purpose, we can either lease those out for development directly to strip back cash from the market and use for other entrepreneurial activities, or we could, which is to say directly develop them, or we could just sell those for cash and then use the cash, these kind of socialized rents, for other entrepreneurial activity, investing in equities, private equity invest, whatever it ends up being. And through
this is the issue with having a 1.25 when you're trying to. Now I kind of feel like I understand, I hear everything. There are certain terms that I'm not super familiar with because I'm not an economist. I haven't researched this. I haven't studied this. If I did study it, I would like be able to understand at the same level as Econoboi. But I'm trying to piece together everything. My only curiosity when it comes down to this is because he said that it's a transition, so there's still the ability to make deals with private owners, right? But I'm trying to think about. I'm really trying to conceptualize like how far does he want to go? That's what I'm trying to work around in my brain. Because okay, a transitionary period is transitionary for a reason. There's always going to be an end goal. So once we hit that end goal, okay, what are those transactions? What are those deals looking like? Right? That's the big question at that point. At that point, what deals are you making? Are you going to be making deals with foreign companies and foreign investors? Is that what the goal is at that point? But then at that point, you're selling things to foreign entities, and I don't know, man.
That process, the state now is either developing assets directly or it transfers assets for cash and uses the cash for development activities.
Okay, I understand the answer. I think it's very unsatisfactory, but okay, I got part one, and then you had two more other points. Yeah,
right. So the other two ways that the state could capitalize these funds, cash, these kind of those assets, right? Owns that, so they're not commercial in nature. I even referenced
to be like, are we selling national parks for cash to capitalize our new public holding firms, or are we selling like Section 8 housing, or are we selling like power plants?
I just said there are going to be some assets that are not commercial in nature. I even referenced national parks. Like you probably wouldn't, you wouldn't sell a national park for cash, but there's a lot of or abandoned buildings that the government owns that it doesn't use productively because the government just has a very poor system of accounting for those assets, right? And so to the extent that we have assets like that we think like, we're not using this basically for any productive purpose, we can either lease those out for development directly to strip back cash from the market and use for other entrepreneurial activities, or we could, which is to say directly develop them, or we could just sell those for cash and then use the cash, these kind of socialized rents, for other entrepreneurial activity, investing in equities, private equity invest, whatever it ends up being. And through that process, the state now is, either developing assets directly or it transfers assets for cash and uses the cash for development activities.
Okay, I understand the answer. I think it's very unsatisfactory, but okay, I got part one, and then you had two more other points. Yeah,
right. So the other two ways that the state could capitalize these funds, number one is just through efficient tax revenue, right? So you just take tax money and capitalize funds. Oh, this we're gonna dedicate a certain amount of tax revenue to a sovereign wealth fund every year, and then once the sovereign wealth fund accumulates enough capital, we're gonna split it off into these different holding corporations. You could certainly do it that way. Another way that the last thing that I'll say, which I think is kind of an interesting way to think about, the Bank of Japan does something a little bit similar, is that the Federal Reserve engages in quantitative easing, where the Federal Reserve creates money and then transfers the cash that they created with financial assets. But our Federal Reserve has the restriction where they only use that cash to buy fixed income. They don't buy equities with that. And so what we could do is engage in the same countercyclical policy that we already engage in. And instead of just buying debt instruments, we could buy equities as well. And through that process, we could accumulate capital and then transfer that capital into a sovereign wealth fund, and then eventually split it off into competing holding corporations once the sovereign wealth fund gets big enough.
Okay, and then so I understand we have a couple of ways that we would get the money there. How do you make the decision of like how many of these holding companies will you have, and who gets, like, how do you do that part?
Yeah, I think in terms of the decision making on how you would do it, I think you would want to have as rules based a system as possible. Currently, I don't know that I would have any strict upper limits on like how big a holding corporation could be. I think that once you would say like, oh, the sovereign.
Can I really dissect the things that he's saying? This does require a good amount of expert economy knowledge in terms of how these systems are implemented, and if he's characterizing them appropriately to apply them to the system that he's referring to. I just don't know the specific details enough to really combat what he's saying. This is very specific. Let me hear what he has to. Oh, this video is gonna be long as fuck. Buckle up, strap in.
And housing, or are we selling like power plants?
I just said there are going to be some assets that are not commercial in nature. I even referenced national parks. Like you probably wouldn't really do it that way. Another way, that the last thing that I'll say, which I think is kind of a an interesting way to think about, the Bank of Japan does something a little bit similar, is that the Federal Reserve engages in quantitative easing, where the Federal Reserve creates money and then transfers the cash that they create as rents for other entrepreneurial activity, investing in equities, private equity invest, whatever it ends up being. And through that process, the state now is either developing assets directly or it transfers assets for cash and uses the cash for development activities.
Okay, I understand the answer. I think it's very unsatisfactory, but okay, I got part one, and then you had two more other points. Yeah,
right. So the other two ways that the state could capitalize these funds, number one is just through efficient tax revenue, right? So you just take tax money and capitalize funds. Oh, this we're gonna dedicate a certain amount of tax revenue to a sovereign wealth fund every year, and then once the sovereign wealth fund accumulates enough capital, we're gonna split it off.
Convincing people to increase their taxes is already an issue. Like, we already have a problem with people not feeling like their taxes are being utilized properly. So again, that puts a lot of reliance on this sovereign wealth fund that is controlled by the state to disseminate their money appropriately, or I guess maybe with he said something about a private autonomous wealth manager or something like that. I forget what the exact term he used. That again, that requires a lot of faith in the people to buy into this, but okay.
Into these different holding corporations. You could certainly do it that way. Another way, that the last thing that I'll say, which I think is kind of an interesting way to think about, the Bank of Japan does something a little bit similar, is that the Federal Reserve engages in quantitative easing, where the Federal Reserve creates money and then transfers that cash that they created with financial assets. But our Federal Reserve has the restriction where they only use that cash to buy fixed income. They don't buy equities with that. And so what we could do is engage in the same countercyclical policy that we already engage in. And instead of just buying debt instruments, we could buy equities as well. And through that process, we could accumulate capital and then transfer that capital into a sovereign wealth fund, and then eventually split it off into competing holding corporations once the sovereign wealth fund gets big enough.
Okay, and then so I understand I guess we have a couple of ways that we would get the money there. How do you make the decision of like how many of these holding companies will you have, and who gets, like, how do you do that part?
Yeah, I think in terms of the decision making on how you would do it, I think you would want to have as rules-based a system as possible. Currently, I don't know that I would have any strict upper limits on like how big a holding corporation could be. I think that once you would say like, oh, the sovereign wealth fund accumulated $15 trillion, and we're going to spin it off into like 15 different $1 trillion holding corporations as like an initial portfolio, you could do something like that. But I think that it's important to note that like currently asset allocation is highly concentrated. I mean, I think the top 2 asset managers in the country control something like $15 or $20 trillion worth of wealth just in and of themselves. And so the holding corporations that do the best are going to accumulate the most capital and make the most returns.
These are assets under management. They're not assets controlled directly by the holding companies, number one, which I think is significantly different because individuals still have the ability to allocate their portfolios the way that they see fit. And then 2, these people, the assets under management, these large firms are not owning the things like wholesale that they are managing assets for, right? Like, it's not like BlackRock or any of these huge assets under management firms are like making decisions for all of these companies unilaterally, kind of like our public holding corporations would be. So I feel like these are meaningfully different in those 2 ways.
Yeah, it's not meaningfully different. What I advocate for is a couple of different structures. So on the first point of it's
wait, real quick. Just in terms of the meaningfully different, it's different to say that somebody has 10% ownership of a stock in a company versus somebody has like a controlling share that's making all the decisions for the company, right?
Yeah, I agree to that. I'm curious. Okay.
Right, but I don't necessarily advocate for holding corporations always buying controlling interest in companies, right? That's what I was going to explain. So these holding.
I think the key term he said is always. So there are situations where it would apply, but
corporations, again, my goal is that these holding corporations would have similar mandates to current asset managers, which is to say that they would have, some basic kind of return threshold. They would need to actively manage the funds, and that once they distribute those funds, they need to balance it on a risk-adjusted basis. They need to have like essentially a risk-weighted portfolio, which means that typically speaking, you wouldn't just go out and buy like a majority of Amazon stock. You might buy 2% of Amazon stock and 1% of Apple and 1% of Walmart. You'd have a highly distributed portfoldio of assets, and maybe you do a little bit of private equity investing or venture capital on the side. And to the first point that you made,
I just want to be careful because
go ahead, Dustin.
Sure. Okay, so that we stay kind of in one area, because there are things that I think would be super based, like having some kind of basically a public dividend for large companies in the United States that is returned to like every American citizen. I think is an amazing idea because it gives all of us a feeling of accomplishment and investment and like return when.
Public dividend is interesting. Public dividend. How are you? Public dividend. I'm guessing like how are you? Could you make the claim because you buy into the goods, you would be able to qualify for that dividend? I guess. Well, that's not the focus. Let's move on.
Our companies do well. Like if Facebook or Amazon or somebody posts huge earnings, the average American doesn't give a fuck unless you have stock in it, right? And I think having some ownership there is great. But we're not talking about just these funds that are broadly diversified and invested in the economy, because this just sounds like kind of an extravagant like IRA or 401k basically. And I think that's meaningfully different than I think we were kind of talking about like controlling shares for these companies, no?
Well, it's so the controlling shares would be that the public would own the holding corporation, right? But we're talking about the holding corporations, which would independently manage the accumulated wealth of the public. So it's a matter of like, what do the holding corporations actually own? And so let's just imagine we get to like my ideal end state,
Okay, holding corporations are the ones that are you accumulate the funds, and that holding corporation invests into these companies. Okay, I'm allowed to finish.
You got like 100 different of these holding corporations, right? And they've kind of like eaten up, BlackRock is literally like a publicly owned company at this point, right? They've kind of eaten up all of those other.
Well, BlackRock is not close to publicly owned, right? But hold on, when we
BlackRock
say
is publicly owned, but it's a it's a publicly traded company. I'm just using that as a quick aside.
Oh, you were saying if they were public, I understand. Yeah. Okay. When we say holding corporations, what I'm trying to figure out is like, how did these get created? Like, let's say that there are two holding corporations in my state, and one is called like Green Energy Forever, and the other one is called like Veganism Rules. And I really want to invest in companies. I would prefer my money would go to the coal-fired dog eating factory people or whatever, right? How does like a new holding corporation get created that would allocate money in a way that I would want to see my public money go towards? Like, that's what I'm trying to figure out. Like, how do you create those new holding corporations? You've talked about how you would capitalize them. Okay, so who would decide how to make them? Yeah.
Well, I mean, in terms of who would decide how to make them, I mean, that, like I said, I mean, I think that would be a rules-based process. You'd probably have some kind of superstructure for, some basic rules that you would establish for managing the whole portfolio of holding corporations, where they would decide, okay, like what are the basic guidances we want to give to these holding corporations? What are the kind of like transparency requirements that we would have? And then similar to your point, like, okay, well, this is how we would determine when to spin off new holding corporations with the accumulations from either tax revenue, other public assets, or the sovereign wealth fund, right? So it would, be with the accumulate, like, okay, well, want to give to these whole rules-based process. You'd probably have some kind of superstructure for, some big.
We're getting captions, bro. I think it's just helpful in the conversation that terms are so valuable to understand. Because I'm not unsure
how you capitalize them. Okay, so who would decide how to make them? Yeah.
Well, I mean, in terms of who would decide how to make them, I mean, that, like I said, I mean, I think that would be a rules-based process. You'd probably have some kind of superstructure for, some basic rules that you would establish for managing the whole portfolio of holding corporations, where they would decide, okay, like what are the basic guidances.
Like, who creates the rule-based structure, though? I guess that's what Destiny's asking. Like, who's in charge of determining how these things are done?
We want to give to these holding corporations? What are the kind of like transparency requirements that we would have? And then similar to your point, like, okay, well, this is how we would determine when to spin off new holding corporations with the accumulations from either tax revenue, other public assets, or the sovereign wealth fund, right? So it would.
The only reason I'm focusing on this part so hard is because, in my opinion, one of the best advantages of capitalism, if you want to be a capitalist cuck, which I am, is that capital can respond efficiently and quickly and robustly to huge economic problems. I think when people argue, there was some paper, I think it was on working paper on IBER or whatever, that said like no liberal economy in the history of the planet has had a massive famine or whatever. And I think part of the argument was that not only is the media able to report on things quickly, but capital can shift very quickly around to different sections of the economy to respond and adapt to different things. So one of the advantages of capital is that people can identify market signals, put money in an area and invest in something, and then do whatever they want there. But when we talk about these holding corporations, we're talking about removing that decision-making apparatus and somehow making it a government thing. And I'm trying to figure out like, how are these things made? And if to gloss over this and then to move on to the rest of stuff, this is like the hard stuff that I would argue that capitalism does anything well. This is allocating capital. Yeah.
Well, right. So there's a number of ways where I think that concern is kind of misplaced. So number one, if we look at how capital is actually invested in current society, and there's a lot of papers on this, is most kind of liquid capital that's invested is passively invested, right? It's like people that aren't even making any sort of an active decision with how they're investing their capital, right? So in some sense, you could say by transitioning a great bulk of that market, if we just were to like neutrally buy assets, so for every one asset that we buy that's actively managed, another one's passively managed. And economists have said that this passive investment is kind of a problem for the allocative process. We're kind of transitioning to a more actively managed market in the first place. So I think that there's some allocative. Sure.
I don't know if I agree with that most capital that is allocated today is allocated passively.
The liquid capital, right? So these are most of the assets that are managed by these institutional investors, like the overwhelming portfolio.
What do we mean when we say passively managed?
So when you pass, well, I mean, you know what passive management is, right? So like passive management is when you would just invest money that essentially just tracks an index on behalf of, it's essentially managed by the asset holding corporation, right? It's not really something that you're going out and sort of trying to find, the actual good investments out there. You're just kind of free riding off of all of the other allocations that are happening actively.
Sure. So I feel like we can call it passive management, but isn't that kind of like one layer removed, because the funds that you're tracking are index funds that are kind of being managed by people that are, trying to pick like a good assortment of funds within a particular index, and then the index itself can change based on market capitalization of companies. And it is like passively managed in the same way that like if I give money to an ice cream maker, I'm like passively giving that money, and I'm not actually making my ice cream, but a guy that's getting the money is actively making the ice cream, right?
I mean, yeah, I understand all that, Destiny. I'm just curious on Econoboi's point in terms of like, what is the issue? That's what I'm curious about. That's kind of where I'm at as of right now.
Well, there's a lot of papers on how this is like an allocative distortion, right? Because when you essentially it makes it to where there's not as much actual entrepreneurial investing activity, and in theory, you're increasing the risk of improper allocation of capital because you're sort of necessarily lowering the amount of actual active investing that people are doing when they're going out and trying to search for the best investments. And so the holding corp.
So I have an idea of what he's trying to say, but I'm gonna have to rewind that again to see if like
you're increasing the risk of improper allocation of capital because you're sort of necessarily allocative distortion, right? Because when you essentially it makes it to where there's not as much actual entrepreneurial investing activity, and in theory, you're increasing the risk of improper allocation of capital because you're sort of necessarily lowering the amount of actual active investing that people are doing when they're going out and trying to search for the best investments. And so the holding corporations, by engaging in an active management process, are kind of effectively solving that problem by some great proportion, and ideally leading to better allocative efficiency. Because again, I do advocate for very strict technocratic management of these assets, in general. And so
sure,
to your point, just the last thing, I just want.
I'm just curious on like why that is more efficient, especially if there's more of a like kind of like potential. I guess there's a layer that he understands about the part of the individuals or the entity that is allocating your funds towards these index funds and finding the best stocks and all that, and determining the best ratio for the index fund that you're being invested in. Like that entity that exists, is he's saying that there is a certain like problem there. There's a certain inefficiency there that does not maximize your stock potential in general, or your money investment in general. But I mean, I guess the argument is if people try to become, I guess, entrepreneurial and do it themselves, I would argue that has more of a risk because there's less of a knowledge and understanding on how these things work. And if you're allocating appropriately based off the conditions of the stock market, so it just requires more of a explicit knowledge if you're being more active. And we see like crypto bros all the time trying to tell you the best way to do these things, and it takes hours of knowledge and understanding. To expect every entrepreneur to also understand that, wouldn't you want to rely on a more of a institution, I wouldn't say institution, more of a sure-handed process, right? I guess that's my only thing. I think it requires too much on the individual and I think there's more risk of failure if they invest improperly. I think there's a disconnect there.
The last thing that I haven't been able to say is that you keep on saying that the decision-making process of capital moving in certain places when they see market activity, again, like that whole competitive process between these asset managers is still internalized into my system, that these big asset managers that are now publicly owned would have the same competitive dynamics and incentives to do the exact same thing under my system as they do under our current system. They'd have the profit motive, market dynamics, But
that's the thing that I don't understand, that's why I keep asking how these are created, because I don't think they would have that same I don't know how they would have that same incentive. Like if there are 5 holding corporations, I still don't know how you pick 5 or how 5 are created. So if one underperforms, do you eliminate it? Now there are 4, or do you spin up a new one? Or
yeah, Destiny, I feel like I've already answered this. So
okay, wait, hold on. Let me answer this very very clearly. Okay, I'm sorry, hold on. Okay. I feel like you haven't answered this at all, and it keeps getting spoke around. I don't know if it's intentional. Okay. All right. So let's say that we are we are restructuring our economy in a way that we want to have these public holding corporations. Okay. So what we do is we have the government that has like a big bucket of money, and the government is going to allocate its money to these private holding, or not private, it's going to allocate money to these holding corporations, and then they're going to basically serve as all of these massive asset managers like BlackRock is. You're creating BlackRocks basically that the government is giving money to for the initial capitalization, and then they're going to be investing in individual firms, and then their metrics are going to be tracked by profit and all that. What I'm asking is, where do those initial holding companies come from? How do you create those initial holding companies? Like, there are 2 or 10. What is the difference? Yeah.
Okay, so so the 3 different ways that I described, you have tax money, you have essentially quantitative easing,
No. I understand. No. You're talking about how you capitalize it. I'm talking about how you create them. How you create
vote
them.
on them. Like, so if
I feel like you haven't answered this at all, and it keeps getting spoke around. I don't know if it's intentional. Okay. All right. So let's say that we are we are restructuring our economy in a way that we want to have these public holding corporations. Okay. So what we do is we have the government that has like a big bucket of money, and the government is going to allocate its money to these private holding, or not private. It's going to allocate money to these holding corporations, and then they're going to basically serve as all of these massive asset managers like BlackRock is. You're creating BlackRocks basically that the government is giving money to for the initial capitalization, and then they're going to be investing in individual firms, and then their metrics are going to be tracked by profit and all that. What I'm asking is, where do those initial holding companies come from? How do you create those initial holding companies? Like, there are 2 or 10. What is the difference? Yeah.
Okay, so the 3 different ways that I described, you have tax money, you have essentially quantitative easing.
No. I understand. No. You're talking about how you capitalize it. I'm talking about how you create them. How you create
vote
them.
on them. Like, so if I wanted a puppy killing holding corporation, and Destiny wanted a Discord DM privacy lock safe guarantee holding corporations, like, how would we
So the way,
vote on those?
so I've already,
would I vote on those?
So,
is what I'm saying.
okay. So I've advocated for this, and I'll say again, I'll try to say it more clearly, for a rules-based kind of superstructure process for doing that. So what do I mean by that? Okay. For instance, right, the Federal Reserve, we have like the Board of Governors, and different presidents kind of appoint the Board of Governors.
No. Federal Reserve has 2 mandates that aren't tied to like the profit motive, or aren't tied.
I'm just using that as an example. Destiny.
No, I understand,
I'm not saying it's exactly the same, right?
I'm not saying it's the same. I'm saying it's disanalogous because you only have one Federal Reserve. We're not talking about creating multiple Federal Reserves, and their goal isn't to make money or pick winners or losers.
That's why I call it a superstructure, right? So again, you might have a superstructure. So all the different holding corporations would have their own boards that are appointed, right, by the public, by this kind of rules-based process. But then you might have a
Okay, I think you might be answering it here.
Superstructure that says, okay, like, this is the general guidance we would give the firms. This is how much wealth we've accumulated in.
Who creates the superstructure and who gives the guidance? Like who? There's a disconnect here. If there's 0 holding companies, 0, how do we create the first one? Because there's no board. And if you're utilizing that as a means to determine what the rules are through this superstructure, then that doesn't exist yet. So how do we create the first one? Like, there's 0 to start out. How do we create the first one? What is that? How does that look? What does that
our financial assets from our sovereign wealth fund? Hey, we think it's time now to vote on whether or not to open a new public holding corporation because, we've got $5 trillion in our sovereign wealth fund. Let's do another $1 trillion like holding corporation and recapitalize it similar to this kind of broad superstructure of competing holding corporations that we have. So I hope I just that's a completely direct answer to that question. I think there'd probably be some kind of superstructure, rules-based, independent technocratic
The next best question right here is, how do you create the first holding company? That is the first question, and based off their line of question, because I have bigger questions in terms of how do you ensure that these holding companies do not become ultra powerful and all that stuff. But
management process for determining how to capitalize new holding corporations. To answer the other question you asked about what happens to firms that fail, the same thing that happens to firms that fail today, right? Like, I believe in hard budget constraints. Once they're capitalized, you're on your own. You got to compete in the market. You have to survive. You have to do what you got to do to basically, earn a living, right? And if these holding corporations were to go bankrupt, then they have to go through the ordinary bankrupt process. The goal of any portfolio is, and this is for the audience because I'm sure you understand this, is that the goal for any portfolio is not for every single investment that you make to succeed at all times. It's just to have a weighted, risk-adjusted portfolio so that you're not overly exposed to any one thing. To the extent that where if one holding corporation or one investment within a holding corporation goes bust, you have enough of a diversified investment pool that you're still getting a lot of returns for the public, a lot of returns from your portfolio at large.
Okay, and then I just want to let the record reflect I'm not happy with the superstructure answer, but I accept it. I'll move on to the next thing. I'm just curious, how do these holding corporations, how do they engage with I don't know what we would call these firms. Are they private firms? Like, would an individual go to a holding corporation and say, I want to start a business that manages electricians, and then the firm might invest in that business, or the holding company might invest in that firm? Or like, what does the ownership structure of these individual firms look like that the holding companies invest in?
Yeah. So they would start out, and I think throughout the process of transition until we get the total socialization, the process would look very similar to what it looks like now, where people would be able to just go out and start businesses and decide the ownership structure for however they wanted. I think that where the holding corporations would come in.
Wait. You keep classifying. People can't start businesses in your model though, because the capital is all managed by the holding corporations, right?
Well, no, because again, there's a huge transitionary period where there's still a
ignore the transitionary period, and let's say that we're past it into your kind of more.
Yeah, I already said that you can't use that as a means to solidify your system's existence, because the transitionary period relies too much on the current system to garner wealth. But
towards much closer to your ideal model. It's not individuals starting businesses. It has to be the holding companies, right?
Yeah. So if individuals wanted to, if individuals in an ideal system, right? So again, I do think that in like complete social ownership, there's, as Matt Brunig told you in your conversation with him, there's like genuinely sticky issues as to like how exactly would you socialize the whole entire economy. I can tell you what I would maybe imagine would happen. So number one, I think that you'd probably still allow for some amount of retail investing, because if you're just like a sole proprietor, I don't think most socialists have huge problems with like sole proprietorships if you just want to go and trade stock. So you still have that quarter of the market that's kind of like retail invested.
Sounds like you're relying on a lot of good faith at that point. Then, what in terms of what they would or would not allow, and then again, that's an issue if you haven't thought about. Okay, now the system is currently in place, and then what happens next in terms of building the capital that you're referring to.
And then other than that, what you would do to start a business is you would probably go to the holding corporation.
I don't understand that. When sole proprietorship has retail investing, I don't know what these things have to do with each other. If I want to hire employees, that would basically be disallowed in your system, wouldn't it be?
Well, retail, I mean, if you're a retail investor, I mean, typically, I think when we talk about like retail investing, we're talking about just individuals. Just
I understand. I'm saying retail investors versus institutional investors. I'm not talking about the investment part. I'm talking about the firms themselves and the ownership structure. I can't, in your idealized version, I can't walk out and hire employees to start a business, right?
Yeah. So in a total idealized system, which again, I have a hard time imagining, I think that we can get to like 75% social ownership. And then, again, these genuinely sticky issues come up, which I think are very relevant criticisms to point out. But I can tell you kind of what I would roughly imagine. I think that if you were going to go out and start a business, you'd probably have to engage in the state in some way. Like you'd have to sell like a portion.
Oh, okay. So now I'm a little bit confused. So are you advocating for a socialist system or like a mixed economy? What exactly? I'm kind of confused, because he's not. He says he advocates for 75%, but it also seemed like he would be willing to go more. So we would have to have the conversation on what prevents it from increasing from 75% to 100%. That's another question. Or does he even care if he gets to 100%? So, there's so much to that I want to dissect, but I feel like what does he want? That's what I'm confused about. I'm confused on what he actually wants. Not what he thinks is possible, not what he thinks is practical. Not what does he want? That's where we got to start from.
Of your equity over time, or maybe you could go out and try to raise funds from other retail investors that would be able to offer you some amount of money, or maybe you have to rely on lending in some sorts, something like that. But I think that once you try to go for like a very, very rigid model, it becomes very, very hard to kind of imagine what that process would look like, at least to me.
Okay, well, I'm unsatisfied with the answer, but I will accept it. Okay.
I guess, yeah, I'm unsatisfied too. You keep switching, Econoboi, and I don't mean to double team you here, right? But you keep switching between, well, there's a transitionary period where the rules would be X, but then I want Y where the rules would be something else. And
right. So
I'd rather talk about. I think what it might be.
So again,
is to talk about.
Let me just answer the question. Yeah, just let me answer the question directly. Okay, I'll imagine an ideal end state, right? So what we might imagine is that you still have about what we have now. We have like 25% retail investors. They're still just doing their little individual investing. I don't think that my socialism. I guess I don't really care if people individually go out and invest money if they want. Now, other than that, it's like, okay, well, how do you start a business? Well, I guess that entire process could be socialized within the holding corporations themselves, where it would basically be these holding corporations deciding what to invest in and why, and they would be competing against each other to do the exact same thing. Now, if an individual, like you guys are describing, like, hey, an individual wants to go out and start a business, well, I guess you'd have to basically go to the holding corporations and convince them to capitalize.
You have to convince, like it's a stand-in for the government.
Yeah. Well, it's independently managed from the government, but ultimately the public would be the shareholders.
The government,
right? You'd have to go.
Appoints them. The government gets to decide who's on these holding corporations, etc.
Well, yeah, but Wick, there's a huge difference between you got to go to a government bureaucrat and you have to go to a technocratically managed asset manager, right? Like it's like the difference between. So, well, it's an independent agency, right? So ideally, it wouldn't be like strictly beholden to like any one government, right? It would have its sort of independent rules-based system that it follows. Now, obviously, the government can,
I also question on the efficacy of like an independent agency, the reliability, and then there's a lot of potential concern this independent agency. Like, what is the authority of the independent agency? One, what is the incentive of the independent agency? Two, and what is the checks and the power and the influence of the independent agency? Three, there's too much good. This is the problem with socialism. It relies on too much good faith on like different entities to not take advantage of the system. Maybe I'm missing something here when it comes to what Econoboi is referring to.
around the edges, I think, make some reforms if they want. I mean, we do have a democracy after all. It wouldn't be like a 100% independent thing. But yeah, if you wanted to start a business, you basically have to go to the holding corporation and convince them to capitalize that business and invest in it. Similar to how people have to go to asset managers today. The only difference, well, I guess not to minimize it, but the only difference would be that would be essentially like your only option. You'd have to go to either a bank or one of these holding corporations, or you'd have to be a retail investor just doing the same thing.
Wonderful.
Right. And in a system like that, I think that we,
So these holding companies would heavily limit entrepreneurship, right? Because I'm sure that the individuals investing into these holding companies would still have the ambition to elevate their wealth. So why would they want the competition, right? There's a lot of
I think there's a good reason to think that even in that kind of idealist version of our system, we would have great levels of equality. We'd get trillions of dollars of dividend payments to, use for public purposes that we wanted. And I think that the allocation process fundamentally would be very sound because, again, the allocation process looks extremely similar to the allocation process that we have today under our current kind of asset managers. And lastly, what I would argue is that, I think that a more egalitarian system in many ways is substantially more entrepreneurial than our current system, right? A lot of these billionaires who talk about how they started their businesses, they don't say, I got $10 billion from my dad, and that's how I started my $10 billion factory, right? It's like, oh, I started in a garage. I got, Trump says I got a small loan of $1 million. Well, obviously, if we horizontalize a lot of that capital and have this much greater equality of opportunity, then ideally there'd be a lot more people that are able to actually live up to their full capabilities in my system versus the current system that we have now.
Okay,
that's not in practice. I don't know if that's true
in this point, right? So,
in practice, I don't know if that's true because there's a lot of. I think he puts a lot of faith into people. There's definitely a concern that people do not optimize or capitalize on their situation to try to move up in society. Like that's more of an American idea because of our free market capitalism. I feel like I've heard this conversation before when they talk about certain Scandinavian countries, and a lot of them don't really have that ambition to constantly move up and become this X, Y, and Z to become the next X, Y, and Z, right? That's more of an American thing, to be honest. I'd be very curious to see how they deal with the entertainment business, because the entertainment business makes so much money. How do you deal with that? A lot of that is privately owned funds that is basically given to you because of how you entertain the populace. For example, how would you deal with a YouTuber? Would you be allowed to be? Oh man, there's so many questions on how this would be implemented.
Destiny first, I guess. What in principle, is the difference about democratically voting to raise taxes and democratically voting for other forms of expropriation? What's this word?
Expropriation.
Thank you. For property. What's the difference between this? So, for example, what in principle allows you to compel a company to turn over a percentage of its profits versus more like what Econoboi is talking about, where the government compels you to work through these holding companies to do your business?
I think, was this a dono?
No, this is just a question I had.
Oh, there's I've got my chat. This man's question 50 trillion fucking times. I think expropriation is meaningfully different than than taxes, because I feel like when people talk about expropriation, you're typically talking about taking like a thing that the person will no longer have access to. Usually you're talking about a form of like a thing, like an actual physical, like a building or something else, you're taking that. Taxes are generally like surplus thing, like they're applied to profits. It's not like you're taxing my revenues and I don't even have money to pay my bills and the government's coming after something and now they're going to take my property or my buildings or whatever. So generally taxes are applied to profits. So excesses, money, things that are like fungible, and expropriation is usually tied to things that are not fungible and it's like taking an irreplaceable thing from you. I think they're meaningfully different things.
Okay, fair enough. To you, Econoboi, is there such a thing? And if there is, can you kind of walk me through it? A liberal socialism. Like, how is liberalism in your mind compatible with the economic model you just kind of laid out there?
Yeah, sure. Number one, I do want to challenge, I do want to challenge Destiny and also you, Wick, because I just don't find, I'm not hearing much in terms of concrete reasons why my model would be like deeply allocatively inefficient or
frankly.
Wick, there's nothing vague about what I'm saying. I'm saying we have all these asset managers now. Just imagine a system where they're all public instead of privately owned. Okay, imagine that, right? Like that's the complete. And if you just literally don't understand how capital is allocated in our system, and so you have no conception of what that looks like, just say that, Wick. But don't say I'm not being specific. Goddammit. Sorry, I got a little.
So the thing, well, it doesn't make sense to say that.
Sure, I'll answer the viewer's question after you respond, Destiny. Sorry.
Or go ahead, you can answer the question.
Yeah. Anyway, so I do actually want to learn. Like, I hear a lot of, it just seems like it doesn't. I want to get into that. Tell me why. So on the answer of can you have a liberal socialism? So yes, I think that for the most part, I think liberalism is defined by individual rights, political equality, things like that. I don't think liberalism is necessarily defined by in large majority part, the ability to start a private business. I think there's a reason why, famous kind of historical liberal J.S. Mill, he endorsed socialism at the end of his life, even though he was a very committed liberal for his time, and obviously had an incomplete view of liberalism himself. But even like contemporary liberalism, probably the most famous liberal thinker contemporarily is John Rawls. And Rawls also endorsed socialism, right? Rawls said that you can certainly achieve liberal ideals with a democratic socialist system. And he thought that because, again, the things about political equality and individual rights, like there's nothing necessarily incompatible with socialism and the idea of having essentially political equality and individual rights.
Democratic socialist system. I just don't know why you just don't call yourself a social democrat then, instead of like straight out socialist, right?
It's right. Like, I don't think my system would abolish free speech. I don't think my system would not be democratic in nature. I've already said, hey, if people just like don't want to do what I'm suggesting, well, vote against it. I don't know. I'm not going to fucking force anybody to do anything. So anyway, so that's kind of what I'm describing ultimately.
Okay, you had something to say, Destiny, to him. We can kind of go through that.
Yeah. So I feel like the challenge is that you say that you're answering questions, but every time you answer the question, we package all of the really difficult things into this like phrase of like an ambiguous superstructure or like the rules or some crazy rule set. And it's like, okay.
We still here? Hello?
What just happened?
I don't
beeped
know.
for a second.
Did it not? Okay, I'm gonna start over. It feels like the issue is every time I try to like figure out how like any of these things are. Wait, is it working? Hello?
No, it is.
You guys are here? I don't.
Go for it.
Okay. Yeah. I feel like we get like the answer is like, oh, well, there would be rules to take care of that. And it's like those rules I think are pretty important. It also seems like we're at the end of the day, when we start to drill it down into this, all we've done is we've basically created capitalism with like a different tax structure. So for instance, I'm very confused. You're advocating for a system of socialism where individuals can still start firms on their own and then scrape excesses from the surplus value created by their employees. That's a very strange. The only difference is we're just the initial investment comes from holding corporations that are capitalized with public funds. Is that the answer? Is that like if I wanted to start a business, am I allowed to hire employees?
Okay, so I feel like, so originally it's like, well, Econoboi, I'm not going to make you just completely, totally lay out a 500-page document of how exactly this works. And so what I answered your question was, let's just imagine that it's a committee superstructure where, hey, we've accumulated $10 trillion of a sovereign wealth fund. We're going to take $1 trillion of that and do one new holding corporation that now has to go out and invest.
Yeah.
I think that, Wick, is pretty specific on how the holding corporation.
Yeah, wait, nothing that you just said there had anything to do with my question.
You asked how they get.
The sovereign wealth fund idea is interesting. I'm more concerned about like the holding company idea, the superstructure, how does that holding company get created to implement the board that would create the superstructure. I'm also interested in the independent agencies that you can rely upon that is able to disseminate the funds. There's like so many questions, and then like the checks on the powers on each level is also very very important. Like capitalism obviously created this country and we've done a lot of great things, and I'm not nihilistic and like ignorant enough to say that America has done nothing good with the capitalist system. That's just objectively not true. The problem is we didn't continuously innovate and continuously challenge it to improve it, to ensure that this wealth disparity doesn't keep growing. We kind of just like allowed it to exist, which brought in more wealth, but it did bring in more wealth inequality at the same time.
And I just answered.
No, can you hire employees? Can you hire employees? Are you allowed to do that?
Okay, so if the new question is not how do you fund or do the holding corporations, but can you hire employees?
Wait, let's be clear. Before you said that, we can go back in the video. My question was literally just, are you allowed to hire employees? That was my question.
Okay, Destiny, are you claiming you didn't ask me 100 times how do the new holding corporations get formed? Though that wasn't a question that was a mainstay that you've asked. I mean, really? Like, come on. You asked that like 5 or 10 times, and I feel like we've kind of been circling the drain on.
I also don't think you really answered that question too. But the problem is that you got the people who was asking the questions did not super focus on it, and they just kind of moved on because Destiny said he wasn't satisfied with the answer. I don't think you should have moved on. You should have hyper focused on it and made it very clear what you want from it. And that's why I provided a very easy question there. It's like, there's 0 holding companies. How do you start the first one? This forces him to figure that out. And then the second part about it, in terms of like the businesses, Destiny did ask about how do you create a business? How do you hire employees? He did ask about that. And I think Econoboi basically said that you would have to approach the holding companies to do that, and that it would require their approval. And then there's another layer of that question, in the sense that something with the independent agencies and their approval and the government, that never got, both those things did not get flushed out. I do think there's a great question. Both didn't get flushed out. They're getting super frustrated for no fucking reason because they weren't locked in.
Give me 1 second. Hold on.
All right, give me a second. Go for it.
He's trying to calm down.
By the way, you asked about if you can hire employees, and I said no. You'd have to interact with the public holding corporations to do that. And I feel like that's pretty specific. I don't know, guys. Like, I just get to choose not answering questions when I give a no as an answer. You know, you'd have to.
I'm thinking he's going back to find the clip of it, but he asked you.
No, find the clip.
And then when you went on about a 500-page document, and
Wick, no, that was literally just now. Wick, he asked, okay, well, what would you do? How would you hire employees? And I said, well, you probably have retail investors that were just individual sole proprietors that don't hire employees.
Question
was that you wanted to hire. Okay,
I'm just asking, like, how can you? I'm asking if you can hire employees. That was my question. Yes.
Okay. So if any of you dicks say, I'm not answering this question directly, I'm going to kill myself on stream in a video game, okay? So, can you hire employees in my ideal system? The answer is no. You would have to go to the capital owners, which are the public in this case, and get them to capitalize your business, and you'd have to have a shared ownership structure. I've said that before.
Wait, just to be clear, you're not saying you would go to the public, you would go to the holding corporations that are ran by technocrats.
To the holding corporations, I'm just saying the public.
So he did say that. I didn't hear no. He was kind of vague about that. He was unsure about that. But he did answer that. Now let's get to the next level of conversation. The validity of this and its effectiveness and its system, and the obviously they could do it. I'm sure they're smart people. We got IQ people up here. They could do it. They could ask the right questions.
Because Wick gets triggered. Oh, it's actually the state. It's actually the government. Yes,
well,
it's the public holding corporation.
You're just saying that the holding corporations would be competing against each other, so you kind of solve for your market inefficiencies there by just calling it the government. So I'm trying to be more charitable to you.
Okay, no, you're being more charitable. Wick is being the fucking dumbass in this conversation. Sorry, Wick, I love you, but Jesus Christ.
Okay to call me a dumbass. Everyone goes after the ref.
Okay. So I'm just trying to figure out, as an individual right now, if I want to start a business, okay, I can hire employees and get initial capital to pay them and sell products and stuff, right? That's how we do business. But in your world, so I would have to, like, I'm just trying to figure, I don't even know what the process would look like of getting employees, or because I can't start a business on my own. What would it even mean to start a business? Are you even allowed to start a business? Or would it just be me and 5 other people who would say, we want to be plumbers, can somebody else make a business?
Again, this is the ideal system, and which is, I think, to me, a little bit harder to imagine.
Be right back. Gotta get my food. I'm hungry, boy. All right, we're locked back in.
Imagine. But yeah, in the ideal system, I think you'd essentially be like the leader of the organization. You'd be like the CEO and not necessarily the sole owner of the business. And I think that's the main difference. But you'd go in and you convince the public holding corporation, hey, like for instance, I'm an engineer who worked in the oil field services industry for 10 years. I think I could start an oil field service businesses. Here's my kind of like my business plan. I think that this is the salary I deserve because I'm the CEO. And the public holding corporation would say, you know what, that sounds like a good idea. Here's $10 million. Go out and make a bunch of money. And, here's some performance pay or whatever. It'd be a very similar system. Again, it's just that the ownership structure would be public instead of private. And that's a very specific example. I hope that is a fucking really concrete, just the oil field services example. That's pretty concrete if you ask me in terms of imagining what it would look like.
Gotcha. Okay. So then for compensation, how are we getting to our more kind of like egalitarian world if the guy is being compensated like so much more as like the owner or like the leader of the company? I'm sorry, not the owner, the leader of the company. Are we also like taxing the additional money that he makes more, or?
So you would have a fiscal state that you tax the income and you would redistribute in the form of welfare payments. The reason why you're getting a lot more egalitarianism, like I said, is because the fundamental problem in our capitalist system is the private ownership of wealth and the capital income from wealth. And so that would be essentially horizontally distributed in my system. Obviously, the CEO would still make, there'd be a multiple in terms of how the CEO is paid relative to the lowest paid employee, but there wouldn't be this kind of huge differentiation of capital income and public wealth I say total wealth in society.
Sure. So what's the difference between, you're saying that the capital income would be more horizontally distributed through some kind of welfare policy. What's the difference between that and just like more taxes in our current system?
So the difference would be that, number one, my system is highly efficient relative to just raising taxes to some crazy amount. So obviously we could just raise taxes to, greatly lower the amount of wealth inequality by like raising a wealth tax. But wealth taxes are bad for the economy, right? Like wealth taxes seem to destroy investment, which isn't really good. My system would, in a number of ways, I think, incentivize investment or incentivize productivity gains, which I've mentioned before. And then with regards to capital income, right? So instead of having to tax corporations, there's so much evidence on taxing corporations and taxing capital income. There's all of these kind of, these flight problems and these problems with adherence, essentially. But you wouldn't get that if all of these things were directly publicly owned. Obviously, you just directly send the payments. Like when I own stock in Apple, I don't have a problem getting capital income from Apple. They willingly give it to me. But if I try to tax Apple, 20%, they're going to do fucking everything they possibly can do to basically avoid paying that tax as much as possible.
Don't you run into a similar problem though if you have competing holding companies? Like let's say I want to be the leader of the oil engineering company that I'm doing, but I want to get paid, since I know I'm going to be horizontally distributed for my profits or whatever, I want to be compensated $20 million. Wouldn't I go from holding company to holding company and they would compete in the same way that you do in a capital market right now for high CEO compensation? Wouldn't that be like an even greater problem since now the CEO is not even compensated with ownership, but has to be compensated directly with wages?
Yeah, well, currently, so I'm arguing for more of a cash compensation basis. But again, the cash doesn't accumulate quite like capital does, right? So you still have this kind of great horizontalization of public wealth. Now, people in my society could still be rich relative to others, but there's a big difference between, the top 10% owns 20% of the wealth and the top 10% owns 2/3 of the wealth like they do in our current society. And there's a big difference between the top 10% has like let's just call it capital income, because that's kind of what you're describing. Like the top 10% has 25% of capital income and the top 10% has 90% of capital income, which is about what it is in our current society. So I'm not saying my society would have perfect equality. It's hard for me to conceive of a society with perfect equality, but it would have much more equality than we have now.
Okay. I feel like boosting all of our tax brackets by 15 points, I think is almost inconceivable, but I think that would be more realistic. And I feel like it would affect better outcomes than this entirely new idealized system that would obviously be incredibly difficult to move to, that I think we don't really have any strong evidence of it even being possible.
Well, we do have strong evidence of, not of the ideal system, but we also don't have an ideal tax code. But that doesn't stop center left people from saying that we need things like a land value tax or these kind of like zoning reforms, these kind of like hyper yimbia stuff. I believe in all that stuff too. No government has a perfect tax code or even close to it, but I think it's still good to advocate for. I think on principles and what we can say about what we know about taxes, it would be a good thing. And certainly I think that there's a lot of examples of public wealth and public wealth management that have gone very, very well for the people that have lived in those societies. And so I'm perfectly willing to say that, hey, in transition, Econoboi, we got up to 85%, public wealth ownership, and I don't know, things
I don't like
aren't
the
working
transition.
out for some reason.
The transition is like transitioning from being a bodybuilder to somebody who only eats junk food constantly. The transition is very boring to me. Like you can eat whatever you want and have the best body ever if you're just coming off of being a professional bodybuilder. And this transition state where we have all the advantages of capitalism and all the advantages of all the accrued wealth of all of the innovation and everything else, and they're saying, oh, well, let's just own all of it like by the state. Sure, expropriation is great on day one, but all the issues that you're running into later on is like, well, how do we decide what to invest in? Like, how are we avoiding all of the problems that we had before? It feels like we're kind of like recreating capitalism with even more bureaucratic layers that I don't know we're guaranteed to have efficient allocation of capital. And we have no like model for this working in the real world right now. So the idea that we'd be able to benefit in the same way that we are right now from all the innovation under capitalism, but also
that's kind of like, we're talking about implementation. That's kind of where I'm at. It's very impractical. I would be very curious in terms of like how is he going to convince the government to do this? Two, I'm just gonna allow them to continue. There's too much in this conversation for me to keep on asking like other questions.
To do the redistribution, I just don't find any compelling evidence around that. Yeah.
We don't have a model of a perfect tax code either, or like a perfect liberalism, or a perfect.
No, hold on. There's a difference.
Right?
There's a difference between a more perfect thing that we're moving in a direction of versus a system overhaul. You're talking about a fundamentally different system, not like tweaking something to make it better than what it is right now, right?
So, well, I don't know. I think in some senses, I would argue that my plan is a tweak of our current system, right? I mean, because again, I tried in my system to kind of internalize the same kind of allocative and sort of investment.
I think you're being a little bad faith here, because there's no way you think what you're advocating for is a tweak compared to like increasing taxes or adding taxes to different sections of the American system. Like little being, this is not even remotely similar. Come on now.
The allocative investment process that we currently see today under the same kinds of institutions that we see today, these asset managers, privately owned versus publicly owned, right? And we do see I was just going to say one last thing, one more sentence, is that we do see a ton of examples of public wealth accumulation. And so I would agree. I would fully concede that, look, we do not know like essentially what the ideal system would actually do, right? But we have at least good reason to believe that the transition to that ideal system can work out very, very well, because it already has worked out very, very well in these other countries. And so I'm saying that for me, at least, for me personally, that's enough evidence to say two things. We should definitely try and like make that transition, because we can make real improvements today. And then two, insofar as that continues to keep working out, we should just keep doing it. And we should keep trying to strive towards that ideal. And I don't think that's an insensible way to think about things or how to label yourself.
I think so. I think it's when I say like entirely different and not just moving in a certain direction. So like, for instance, like in the society that you're talking about, if I wanted to start a company and none of the technocratic boards or whatever were okay with that company starting, I would be disallowed from starting that company in my country. I wouldn't be allowed to do that.
Sorry, say that again. I got distracted.
Let's say that I wanted to start a new firm that makes retro Game Boys, and none of the technocratic boards are on board with me making my new Game Boy manufacturing firm. I would be banned from doing that. It would be illegal to do that in the new country that we've created.
Well, you'd have to contract it out in some way, right? So you wouldn't be able to own capital yourself, but obviously to the extent that manufacturing retro Game Boys would just be, a specialized process of different services that you would need to do in order to do it, you could create that proof of concept, and then again, you can have a sole proprietorship where you're the one that actually kind of manages this and accumulates it, and then goes from there.
We can't set a sole proprietorship. I think we're using clever tricks to avoid the hard question, because if I have a sole proprietorship, then could I not just hire 10 other 1099 people? Like you recreated the 1099 model of, well, they're not my employees, they're just other sole proprietors. I could just recreate firms using 1099s instead of W2s and former like C-level structure. No, like I don't.
Well, yeah, I mean the way. Well, but that's a question for your regulatory state, really. So it's like, how do you?
No. Conceptually, it's important that you, in your world, if you can convince a technocratic board, you ban that. You can't just start a company that if you want to.
Okay,
you can't get it on board with it.
But I'm saying I can easily just hand wave that and just say, okay, well, you can't. There's no 1099 employees, right? You have to hire like actual companies that exist that are full-time employees. Like I don't know. It seems easy enough to just kind of say that that's a thing or a barrier that you might have.
I can't hire them because I don't have the money, because I don't have capital in this society. I'm not allowed to start a business or like hire employees and stuff.
Well, in our current society, there's a lot of people with great ideas that don't have shit for money, and they can't start any business at all because it's so inegalitarian. And that was one of the points that I made earlier, is that in my society where people are so much more egalitarian in terms of
I'm not contesting that in your society, some people that could make companies that don't have the ability to now might be able to. That's obviously true, right? I'm sure there are some people with good ideas that can't raise the money for it. But in your society, if you did have money for a business that you wanted to start, but you couldn't get any of these giant holding companies on board with it, you would be disallowed from doing so.
Well, no. So you said two different things there, right? So you said, if I don't have the money, I'm just fucked, right? And I said, well, obviously there's a lot of people in our current society that don't have the money to start businesses, and they're fucked, even if it's maybe a good idea. But then you said, okay, well, what if I do have the money? It would be illegal for me to start that business. To which I said, well, no, obviously if you have the money to start that business, you might have to like hire a bunch of different companies to kind of like, bring those people together. And you might have to go to like the CNC, factory to, get the Game Boy, whatever fucking like form or something like that. And you might have to go to another company to say, I want these kind of like motherboards to be made. And then, you'd have to assemble it with some sort of technical skill. But
yeah, but if I don't have the approval from a technocratic board, how do what you're describing is financial capital. How can I do that if the board doesn't approve me?
Well, but you said you have the money. So again, in my system, people would still like be able to make a lot of money, right? So let's say that you're like a rich CEO.
Let me back up. I'm so sorry. Okay, I'm being unclear with my terms. Okay, so money is money in the bank. I'm sorry. When I'm thinking capital, I'm thinking of investment in like private property in capital, like stuff that generates revenue or whatever. My understanding is that. So I asked earlier, like, are you allowed to hire employees and like have a firm traditionally like that? And you said no, because you have to convince the holding company to allocate you basically the model of the business that makes you the owner, or not the owner, the leader of some business. And I'm saying, okay, well, if I can't convince any of those people, even if I have the money, I wouldn't be allowed to create my firm because I haven't been able to convince any of those technocratic boards to allow me to create that firm. And it sounds like you're saying, well, you can create the firm if you have the money. You just have to hire other companies. It sounds like we're just like we're using like clever accounting ways of like recreating capitalism.
No. So again, I've already said pretty clearly that I don't think, because sole proprietors, like they necessarily don't have other employees, right? So it's just a matter of like who's actually doing like the final product distribution. Like in my society, you'd still be able to hire someone to like cut your grass for you, right? I mean, just like, because that's just like a service that you can hire for, right? And so
the only way I did this is that's not this hiring somebody to cut your grass. You're not hiring an employee. You're paying for service, right?
If I'm trying to make retro Game Boys, I can hire the CNC factory to do the molds. I can hire the computer electronics factory to do the motherboards. I can do this, that, and the other, and then I can assemble it, and then I can go out and sell it, right? Because you're just the one person who's making the final product and then selling it. That's your value add.
Sure.
You made the final assembly, so you can still do that in my system.
Okay, so I understand. Okay, so I understand what you're saying. So you're solving for that problem, but then if you solve for that problem by saying that if you have enough money, you can go and contract out all these other socially owned firms or whatever to do this stuff, haven't you also reintroduced the problem of don't wealthier people then have more access to creating their dream businesses because they don't have to go to the technocratic boards and get approval? They can just do it with their own money.
Yeah. Like I said, my system is not perfectly egalitarian in any means, right? It's just so substantially more egalitarian than we see now, right? So 10% of people having 25% of the wealth or capital income or something because they're wealthy CEOs is not ideal, right? But I do think that you do need some kind of like pay inequality in order to incentivize essentially like growth and productivity and performance pay and things like that. So
sure, I understand that. But at the end of the day, the only way that you're solving for this, even in your system that is far different than what we currently have, the only way that you're solving for this is still just basically taxation, right? Except your taxation is coming in the form of eating all of the profits and maybe paying less wages to people, and then you're redistributing that in the form of welfare to people that aren't making as much. So it feels like a really complicated way to do more tax.
It's definitely not just, again, it's definitely not just taxes, right? Because again, like the accumulated wealth of the public holding corporations is also horizontally distributed, right? So when I say horizontally distributed, I'm talking about like in an accounting sense, because one person, one vote, we all kind of control public wealth or whatever.
Sure.
But that public wealth is not in private accounts anymore.
Well, what I say is it's basically like what you're doing is basically creating a 100% corporate tax rate, right? That's really what we're doing here.
Well, in a crude sense, you could say that, but obviously these firms would have retained profits and they would have reinvestment and stuff. They would have a dividend.
Reinvestment is not tax, right? So you're just creating basically a 100% corporate tax rate. Obviously, they would still do reinvestment in business and everything. You don't tax revenues, you tax profits, and then we're just taking that 100% corporate tax rate and then we're redistributing it in the form of other welfare payments.
Well, again, because profits can be retained in my system, just like in our current system. So the actual dividends would be quote unquote taxed 100%. Like what you're distributing to the state is going directly to the state, obviously, right? But it's
so when you say profits are retained where?
Like in the treasuries of the individual corporations.
But wouldn't that just be the giant holding companies?
Yeah, the individual corporations within the holding companies' portfolios or the holding companies themselves. Just like again,
yeah, but those holding companies. It's not really retained in the individual companies themselves because the holding companies could just reallocate that capital to a more profitable business if they wanted to, right? And they would. Well, we want them to do that, right?
They could have like a shareholders like prioritization in that regard, like what to do with the money in the corporate treasury. But again, my system has very like distributed ownership amongst these holding corporations, right? A holding corporation could say, hey, we're going to buy out 100% of Apple, and that's just going to be like our company, like we're the holding corporation that owns Apple or whatever. But I think that for the most part, you would see similar to like BlackRock and Vanguard, you would see that BlackRock and Vanguard don't really own a lot of controlling stakes in any one company, so they only have like this like proportional influence in what corporations do with their balance sheet. That's the competitive process that I want to retain.
But then I don't understand then. So you would just have like 5 state-owned holding corporations, and then all of them would have non-controlling shares in firms.
Well, I would probably have like 100 holding corporations in my ideal sense, right? So there'd be a lot of them. Again, it would be a matter of like, what do the managers of the holding corporations think are the best investments? So they might think it's good to just buy out a company and say, we own this company outright. We think we can run it better than these other holding corporations. Or they might just say, hey, look, based on our return guidance, we're just going to go out and buy 1% of this company, 3% of that company. Again, similar to how these asset managers allocate capital today.
You keep saying similar to how these asset managers allocate, but it's not at all the same way that these asset managers allocate capital.
Their balance sheets would look I'm saying their balance sheets would look similar to that, right? That like, sometimes they buy out companies wholesale and then sometimes
that's fine. And I probably eat the same amount of calories as like an Olympic female swimmer who's like, 4'11". But it's not even remotely the same. The way that the capital is allocated and how they're making decisions is completely and totally different.
You get what I'm saying though, Destiny. Obviously you get what I'm saying.
No, hold on. I don't get what you're saying, because what you're doing is you're going to the easy part of saying like, oh, like let's just collect the profits here, but you're ignoring the whole process of how that capital is allocated initially, how firms are started and all the incentives along the way.
I'm not ignoring it though. So I'm not ignoring it. So just to be clear, right? So every company today, right? If you look up Amazon stock, right? Who owns Amazon? I think Jeff Bezos owns like 15%. Retail investors own like, I don't know, like 20 or 30%. And then a bunch of different big giant institutional investors own 1, 2, 5, 8, 7% of Amazon. That's like the ownership structure of just Amazon. So in my system, you would have, again, these big institutional investors displacing the same exact kind of like 70% ownership of Amazon as well. And they would go out and they would say, okay, I think Amazon's a good investment. I'm going to buy their stock. I'm going to hold it. I'm going to influence the board in the way that I think is valuable. And then I might sell that stock to other holding corporations or other individuals who might want to buy it on the sole proprietorship side. And go from there, right? Like, it would be still a liquid market that you could do with what you want with your money and allocate it entrepreneurially. And you're incentivized to do that because you would have things like performance pay, and you'd be able to set dividend policy. And I think
what would you do? How would you decide when to end like a holding corporation? Like, what if you had some holding corporations? Like, there are different ways that I would balance my portfolio given my stage in life, right? At an earlier age, I could take a little bit more risk. Later on, I'm looking at investments that are way more stable, risk-adjusted return, and everything. How would I balance out? Like,
sorry about that. The people here to watch me eat, but boy's hungry. I would also be curious in terms of like, I'm very curious on the individuals that benefit the most from the system, right? The CEOs, for example. Because I'm thinking about it. Sovereign wealth fund, the holding corporations that the public owns, but an independent agency is the one who determines the allocation of the funds and the capital. Like, I agree with Destin. Like, there does seem like there's more steps, and you would really have to question the individual steps themselves. But we'll see if they get into that.
which, like, when do you end a holding corporation? Is it when they run out of money and make bad investments, or?
Yeah, they would either be acquired by the other holding corporations, or they would be they would go bankrupt. Just like regular. They would, in theory, they would exist in perpetuity.
Wait, can holding corporations buy shares of or buy other holding corporations?
Yep, ideally.
Can we imagine what Trump would do if he controlled all?
No, because Trump wouldn't have unilateral control from the executives to be ran by a whole different boards of people for each one. But
thank you, Destiny.
You don't think that we would be into a situation to where all of these holding companies would just ended up like held by a couple holding companies anyway? Like, if there was a holding company and they made really good decisions on how they invested in stuff, wouldn't I just want like to buy some shares of just that holding company? Are we like recreating index funds here as well?
Right. So similarly, like right now, the single largest shareholder of BlackRock is Vanguard, right? One of its competitors. But they still compete against each other.
Hold on. Is it Vanguard, the institution, owns the biggest share, or is it assets under management that has bought shares of that? Because those are two very, very different things, right?
Well, obviously it's assets under management, right? I'm just talking about like they're managing the assets, I suppose. But it's just about the allocated process itself. And so when it comes to the holding corporation,
wait. Those are very, very different things, right? Because in your world, these are not assets under management. These are state funds. These are initially capitalized by the state, and it's like the state that owns basically like the totality of all of these different holding companies. So these aren't just assets under management where you can just move them from one holding company to another, right? So that I'm just saying it's a meaningfully different thing. Because you keep saying like, oh, well, BlackRock owns all of this. Well, no, those are investors that invest in BlackRock and in Vanguard, and then they allocate their money that way. And those assets are managed by BlackRock and they're managed by Vanguard, but they're not Vanguard or BlackRock's funds themselves. I think it's meaningfully different, right?
So obviously it's meaningfully different in the sense that, again, it's not individual accounts, right? So the account here would be the public. It wouldn't be like individual accounts like you're describing. But I think that in terms of just that allocative process, like, okay, can we imagine at least that this allocative process, these assets under management are being allocated by Vanguard, either passively or actively? Can we recreate that process under a public ownership ideal? I think certainly that we could with these public holding corporations. And so I can't remember the original, we got kind of sidetracked. I can't remember what your original question was.
Just if holding companies can buy other holding corporations, I feel like we're recreating like index funds and we're recreating everything else.
Yeah. So you said wouldn't eventually you have some concentration or anything like that, right? And so my answer is certainly yes. You would have concentration. Markets naturally concentrate kind of ownership and power to some degree, right? Because in theory, one company is better than the other ones, and people only shop there or whatever. So you still have this kind of concentration of ownership probably over time. But that's why my system, you still have to have fiscal actors, and you still have to have things like antitrust. So my system would ideally, and you see this all across the world, the best systems will have public-owned assets, but then they also have adversarial regulators that will try to, ensure that they're, playing by the rules, being transparent, being audited. And so my system would have the same thing.
Okay, and then I'm just curious. Well, okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so I guess, Destiny, would you say that you're skeptical of my model? Just essentially because we can't see an example of it working, right? Because obviously you would agree that, to the extent that my model is a transitionary state, it sounds like you might agree, like, yeah, the transition might be great to have something. You said, having like a public kind of stock company or something would be great. You just don't believe in 100% ownership. Maybe it has to be 60% or something like that. You just can't. It's hard to imagine going the full 100.
There's questions of getting to the full 100, but the real problem is that when people talk about public ownership, I don't think that people are ever talking about public ownership. They're talking about public profits, which are taxes. And the hard part about public ownership isn't in the getting profit. That's easy. It's the making decisions. So when we talk about the difference between like 60%, 90% or whatever, that's not really the hard part. The hard part is the difference between like 1% and like 51%, or like controlling shares in companies, because that's where all of the hard parts of capitalism in an ideal world are working. Well, in our current world, work the best is when people decide where to allocate their money towards. But if you're not being punished by profit incentive, then we have to look to other ways to guide investment. And it sounds like right now in your system, that way would be debating, I guess, like a board of technocrats to convince them that your business idea is a good idea, and you hope that you can convince them.
Well, yeah, I mean, my system you would be punished by the profit incentive as well, right? So again, businesses can still start and fail in my system. I guess in some sense you could say that there's like extra steps to starting a business in my system. It doesn't look quite the same, which I fully concede.
Well, what's the penalty for like a holding company failing? Like what happens?
They would go bankrupt, and everyone that works there would lose their jobs.
But they would still, I mean, they'd be fine, right?
Why would they be fine? They'd be unemployed.
Because in your system, you have massive horizontalization of all of the profits that are being controlled by all of the other holding corporations. So there's not like any real detriment at the end of the day.
Well, they would still qualify for welfare benefits, obviously, right? But I mean, people, welfare benefits only replace such a high percentage of your income, of course, right? I mean, capital income is only like 30% of income. So, you'd still be pretty fucked if you got laid off from your job, right? So, you'd still be incentivized to do a good job and not get fired. And,
Yeah, I guess, but you could take, I just feel like there could be so much more theoretical risk such that if they go bankrupt all the time, it might be worth it, right? Because at the end of the day in your system, you'd be guaranteed at least, I'm guessing, like a house, a TV, a car, the ability to have 1 month paid vacation, phone with internet, like all these things would be guaranteed. So if I was like the technocrat managing this holding corp, I'd probably be looking for insanely risky investments because fuck it, why not, right?
Well, again, so I really don't think so, just because, we see like, for instance, we see like capital accumulation, like capital investment in many other countries that have, much more generous welfare benefits than we do here. And, there's a lot of papers about, there's a lot of papers about this that'll say that, in many different ways, just having.
There are some like good ideas here. I've been kind of just letting them ramble for the most part. There's some good ideas that I do think is worth entertaining, right? I mean, the aspect of a publicly owned like fund to be able to compete with these kind of like private firms or these very rich individuals is an interesting proposition. Another very interesting proposition would probably be like the idea that there's more of a involvement from the government to ensure that capital allocation is used better in terms of disseminating the welfare benefits across the state. I guess my biggest thing when it comes down to it is still like, how do we start this? Like the implementation is, I guess, a different conversation. Like, how do we implement that? Let's set that aside in terms of implementation, if it's even realistic. I'm sure they might get into that in this conversation. We'll see. I'm still like curious on like the checks. He did entertain the idea that there's going to be certain policies to ensure that there is a check to it. But if there's a situation where the public in and itself are, one, is there a concern? Well, they actually entertain the idea of a holding corporation buying out another one. So I guess maybe, but okay, if we're a system based off like democratic principles and the people get the share of the funds, and then there's like, let's just kind of play this scenario out where they want the holding corporation to own everything, so they have more wealth within that holding corporation, all the individuals. And then because there's such a large individual group, and then you would imagine that this would be expanded, ultimately they would also vote in favor of eliminating this policy, and they will vote in congressmen to eliminate the policy to allow this type of monopoly to exist, because it would incentivize or it would be in favor of the people who own the holding corporation, which would be the people. So they would want this monopoly. And then eventually, like, how do you check a system when everybody benefits from that system, and eventually a potential one monolith holding corporation does exist? And obviously we can talk about how that could lead to like a very, very dangerous situation in terms of all that accumulated power. So you got a circumstance where people are incentivized to screw over the system to benefit themselves in that circumstance too. Like, and then obviously I'm very curious on like the trust of independent agencies to allocate these things appropriately. Like there is stuff that I'm still have questions.
Generous welfare benefits is actually very, very good for economic growth because, like, literally kids will grow up with bigger brains, and people will feel more comfortable taking risks.
But in all
right?
of those states that you're talking about, the capital owners are getting all of the benefit from the capital accrual. But in your system, you've eliminated that benefit. So I don't know what the
again. So welfare capital income is only about 25 to 30% of income, right? So that's
what do you mean when you say that?
horizontally
25 to 30% of income. What does that mean?
all the income payments that are paid out, about 30% of it is capital income, right? So labor still makes, the vast majority of income, like total income that's paid out is paid to labor, not capital owners.
Wait, but that doesn't make any sense because if you're trying to solve for wealth inequality, you're not talking about just capital payouts. You're talking about capital accrual, right? You're talking about like increase in wealth, right? So you have to find a way to redistribute that as well, no?
Well, so the wealth at the end of the day, so like for instance, if a holding corporation goes bankrupt, right, those assets would go under a managed bankruptcy. They would be bought out by other investors. In this case, it'd be other holding corporations. I understand. But
when you say 30% of stuff is paid out by capital, like when you say that, you understand that the vast majority of the wealth that's being created in this country goes to rich people, not because they're getting dividends, but because the capital is increasing in value, right? Like Jeff Bezos isn't worth what he's worth because the Amazon stock he has is paying him sick dividends. He's worth that much because the business itself has grown to that value, right?
So maybe I'm misunderstanding your point. So what is your point about people would be incentivized to take infinite risk because now the capital's publicly owned, but I think they still engage in substantial, they still are substantially punished by risk for risk if they fuck up and don't get their performance pay or get fired or their whole company goes bankrupt, right?
Yeah,
I guess another very interesting question is like, would this affect the consumer problem? Because just like what Destiny is talking about is that there would be a much more deliberate incentive to be adherent to your holding corporation and the companies that is being invested in there. So that would affect consumerism as well in terms of the things that they go after. And I don't know if maybe he thinks that's a good thing. I don't know, but I wonder if they're gonna
figure out like in terms of the holding corporations. Like if we're saying that if we're saying that there is like a decent upside if you pick better than anybody else, right? Because now the public funds. Or wait, hold on. When you're capitalizing these initial holding corporations, do they just get like the starting money and then they don't get any more money, or how do they get more money, or do they ever get more money?
So hard budget constraint. So they would get the initial capitalization, and then any money from there, they would need to raise capital from other entities, or they would need to do balance sheet financing.
Wait, what does raise capital from other entities mean?
So they would need to go take out from the competing set of other banks that would offer capital to them. They'd have to get loans. They would have to go out and use their balance sheet, or they'd have to maybe they would go to other holding corporations and engage in joint ventures, things like that.
I feel like we're just hardcore recreating capitalism with way more paperwork in between.
So again, we're recreating the competitive dynamics of our system. Capitalism is when the ownership is privately owned, right?
Yeah, but the competitive dynamics only work because you're competing for the payout at the end, right? To some extent.
Well, I think that a lot when you look at a lot of these corporations, right? So a lot of these corporations do have like share-based compensation and things like that. But I think a lot of the investment that we see here.
Hold on, wait. When you say that, a lot of these corporations have share-based compensation. The most successful corporations in our country right now are owned by disproportionately insanely wealthy people, right?
Yeah, sure.
So what is that? I don't understand what that was supposed to solve.
Because I feel like what you're saying is the thing about capitalism, the reason why we've been able to accumulate such wealth is because of this disproportionate ownership. Like you're incentivized to basically engage in entrepreneurial activity because you have the incentive of being worth a lot of money. You have the ownership of the things that you're doing. Now, what I would say is that isn't quite right. I think that the main reason why people go out and there's a lot of different reasons. I guess your theory of entrepreneurship. A lot of people, number one, just like to do it. A lot of people are perfectly fine, like innovating but not being owners. Like a lot of the innovations within corporations come from workers and not necessarily owners. But to the extent that those like the sort of great man theory of capitalism, that you have like these great people who come up because of this huge incentive to accumulate wealth. Again, when we talk about, I'll make 2 points and then I'll throw it over to you. When we talk about a lot of these people and how they actually started their businesses, right? They started with a very little amount of capital investment, and then they just, it essentially like it accumulated from there, right? So the initial capital investment was quite small, so you can kind of min-max there. And then on the other hand, it's like, okay, well, what actually incentivizes people to do productive activity? I think it's more so just their compensation, right? It's just like, okay, are we providing performance-based compensation? I don't think that performance-based compensation necessarily has to be in the form of shares, right? It could just be in the form of just cash bonuses that we give to people.
I don't disagree for like employees, but I feel like owners or entrepreneurs, I think, approach it a little bit differently. They're not just looking for like high compensation or high payout necessarily. I think they're looking for like ownership of the business or the entity that they're creating. I think it's a really important part of that.
Sure. Yeah. We're operating on conjecture. I don't think it's actually that important. I think that when you it seems to me that when I talk to really type A entrepreneurs in the world, they would tell you, look, I just love what I do and I don't give a shit and I just like doing this kind of work or whatever. And I think that when you look at a lot of the innovations that get made, a lot of it's from public investment, from individual workers at companies, like scientists that do a lot of, research they're not like wealthy business owners. They're just technically trained people that love to do what they do. Now, again, I'm not saying,
but like love to do what they do is like, that's like a certain employees or like career.
No, exactly. That's what I was going to say.
Okay.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Last thing.
I probably agree to them that there is the only reason why the ownership aspect is so enticing because of the growth potential. So as long as they're getting like a large amount of money, it also is a comparative vision to the current system that has the opportunity to become like billionaires and trillionaires. So like if you take that away, that incentive, that vision, that comparison model, then as long as they are getting wealth and be able to do their ambition while also being able to benefit greatly from it and not being able to have to worry about common day things, I think there would still be a lot of incentive there. So I do probably agree to Econoboi in terms of that.
I was going to say is that, my sense is that, look, we do have to incentivize people to engage in like high value added activity, right? But I don't think that we necessarily need to incentivize that activity by having, a bunch of billionaires in society. I think that rather we can just have a bunch of CEOs that are paid, in the millions of dollars, but they're not necessarily accumulating like billions of dollars of capital to do what they do. I think that that's, to me, lines up more so with my understanding of how innovation and productivity enhancements actually happen. But okay, Destiny, I was gonna ask you, Destiny, though, because again, what's your ideal system, right? Because it sounds like when we've spoken before that your ideal system it seems to look very similar to the Nordic model. That's why I said like, hey, if we can agree that okay, we should get to a world where the GDP is 45% from socially owned entities instead of 20 or 30% like it is today. Like that's still a huge amount of socialization in the economy. But I don't know if you actually endorse the Nordic model. Like, what does your ideal system look like in terms of wealth distribution and who owns what?
So I don't know if the Nordic model is 45% social ownership. But my ideal psychological one, which will never happen, is that if people just didn't care about wealth inequality so much, I feel like there are real psychological things that you have to actually deal with. I think you do have to care about it, unfortunately. But the second thing is that I tend to advocate for way more redistribution, because I don't think that redistribution is as much a deterrent to business owners as anything else. I do think ownership of the business is important. But I think if you were to talk to a business owner, like you're saying that, oh no, they just have a passion for what they do. But I think part of what they do is they own a thing. And that's like a thing that feels cool and good to them, is because it's their business. So I think that as long as they still have their business, if you tax them even fucking 5 or 10 percentage points more, I don't think people are like, oh, I don't want to have this business anymore, fuck that. But if you just say, oh no, like this is just going to be owned by the state, or you don't get to have like controlling decisions about it, I do think that would heavily discourage people from having businesses, because fuck, well, now it feels like it's not even my thing anymore.
The controlling, I agree with the controlling decisions. Not being able to have controlling decisions could also prevent it from prevent innovation to prosper as well. And then there's another aspect of like making tough decisions that play into becoming super wealthy, but there's another aspect to it. Like, do we want that? I'm not going down that rabbit hole. We're about an hour and 30 minute, and I'm about a 2-hour video right now. I'll see how long before my brain just was like, oh, I've been here for too long.
I basically just more redistribution. I think that
Yeah, so I think I guess I just disagree. I think that there's a lot of evidence that taxes, and especially the kinds of taxes that politicians are likely to favor, are very bad for the economy, right? Like, for instance, even in the Nordic economies, which I do uphold, they have really inefficient tax systems, which many papers would show you are pretty bad for their economy at large. But obviously, they're not like so bad that it destroys the economy. They're just like marginally worse. I
agree with you, but I think there are some taxes that are really good. They're just politically unpopular. Like I think most economists like property taxes. I think are good, and I think that income taxes I think are good. Progressive income taxes. I think these are both very good taxes, but they're like the least popular ones politically. And everybody fucking hates them. But I think that like some of the worst taxes that people talk about are things like financial transaction taxes, which we're not really talking about here, I guess, because we don't have like stock markets as much anymore in your system. But then the other hated tax is the corporate tax, and your system is essentially like 100% corporate tax rate system. And I feel like it's one of the most inefficient ones that most economists think is a bad tax.
So that's why I made it very clear, right? So there is a huge difference between a 100% corporate tax and owning 100% of a business, right? So for instance, I don't think that it makes the business, I don't think that we would have to make the argument that the shareholder structure of Amazon makes Amazon less productive because they send out, I don't know if Amazon pays a dividend, but whatever. They pay a dividend out, or they pay return capital to their shareholders, right? That's a totally different thing than does the tax from the state cause negative things to happen to the operations of that business. There's a lot of papers that show that corporate taxes are bad for business accumulation and business formation, but there's not a lot of papers that say that basically just paying out dividends are bad, because that's your incentive. You're incentivized to do that as a corporation. You're supposed to return capital to your shareholders.
Yeah, but you can return capital a ton of different ways. I don't think there's much difference between dividends versus just the value of the stock increasing, for instance.
Yeah, but you're making an efficiency argument and describing my system as 100% corporate tax when that's really not it. My system doesn't take all the corporate profits and mandatorily extract it away from the business. My system has a system where corporations,
the owners of the business, profits are for the owners of the business, right?
Right. Well, the owner, again, in my system, the owners wouldn't just literally like scrape off like all the profits from the business. There would be a dividend policy decided by the board that was on balance what we could return to shareholders with the actual long-term interests of this corporation, similar to what we see now. I hate saying that because you seem to not like when I say that, but
wait, I don't know. Hold on, wait. You're the business. I don't know why you can't own. I'll buy bullets in my system. You have to bite the bullet on this. There are no profits in your system for the business. Those all are gone. Those all go to the state, to the holding companies to be distributed.
Why would they be gone? I don't understand.
Because if profits still exist in some manner to be redistributed to people working at that business, you've just recreated all of capitalism. Because now when these holding companies are looking to invest in businesses, employees are only going to work for businesses that have like profitable distribution structures, and then holding companies are only going to invest in businesses that have more profits.
But
then you just recreated capitalism and all the wealth inequality.
Market competition is not capitalism. Capitalism is when production is privately owned. In my system, production is publicly owned, but you still have market competition. So obviously a business, like we said at the very beginning of the conversation.
Hold on, wait, this doesn't make sense. It can't be publicly owned if the profits are private.
No, so the profits
can't be private in a publicly owned system.
No. So it's not about the profits. The profits are not privately owned in the sense that the people who are deciding what to do with the profits are individual investors, right? I'm advocating for, you said the hard part is the decision-making process. So I'm being what I think to be in depth about the decision-making process. The decision-making process would be technocratic, and it would be very similar to what we see.
If I work for a company and there's a billion,
for fuck's sake.
Define technocratic. My brain is about to turn off because I'm getting a headache. I've been recording all day, to be fair. A lot of videos coming out that are maybe already out. I don't know. What is technocracy is a model of governance wherein decision makers are chosen for office based off their technical experience and background. Okay.
Technocratic. That's not saying anything. I'm asking. Let's say I work for a firm.
I didn't finish what I was saying.
I know, but you're just saying general. Okay, I work for a firm that's got $1 trillion in profits. Where does that $1 trillion in profits go?
So the board of that, similar to today, fuck's sake, the board of that company would make a decision on how much profits do we need to retain? What do we want to use those profits for? How much profits based on our dividend guidance can we actually send to the owners? That's how fucking Amazon works, fucking Apple works, Tesla works. They all do that. They have a general dividend guidance where they want to send a certain amount of capital to their shareholders, but then they obviously keep a lot of their profits for things like reinvestment, for things like paying down debt, and yeah, for things like employee compensation. But that's not like a radical departure from what we see now. The radical departure is
that's a radical departure because
capital.
Profits are not ever for employee compensation, right? Profits are the excess that you have after everything else, including cost of labor. Profits are the things you have that you return to the shareholders, right? But in your world, I can't tell who the shareholders are. So the shareholders should be
in our system. In our system, we do not return 100% of the profits to the owners of the company. Now, you're right to say that the owners of the company
have. That's what you're supposed to do. What do you mean?
No, you're absolutely. Destiny. Okay. Do you think when Amazon makes $1 billion in profits, shareholders get a $1 billion check?
If there's nothing else to invest the money in, yes.
Right, exactly. If there's they have to make the decision. If there's nothing else to invest the money in, if we've paid out all of the shit that we need to pay out, if we don't want to pay down our debt, then we send the rest to the shareholders. But that's not the same thing as a 100% shareholder tax. And my system's not 100% corporate tax because businesses would have to say, hey, we've paid all of our employees. We don't have anything else that we want to invest in. We have this money that's left over. We have this dividend guidance. That's how much money we're going to send to our shareholders, which happens to be the public in my system.
Which is all the profits.
No, it's not. It's not all the profits. A lot of the profits are retained and used for other investing activities or used for
that's reinvested. That's like sure, but that's like reinvested stuff is not the excess money that you make at the end of everything else, right?
Right, but
like,
what's taxed in a corporate tax is not money after basically every single investment you make. It's just the accounting profit of the business, right? Obviously, with a lot of complications, but you get what I'm saying. Like,
all right, I'm gonna be back. I'm getting a little headache, so I need to get some water. But I'm trying to with the headache, the migraine I have right now. It's hard to. I'm trying to figure out what the distinct differences in how they're viewing this is, but be right back. All right.
Corporate taxes tax a much broader set of money than just money that's finally available to shareholders.
Isn't in a general sense, isn't that generally what corporate taxes are aimed at? Like, you don't generally tax like revenues, right? It sounds like you're talking about revenues, and I'm talking about profits.
No, but again, you do tax corporate profits, right? But there's a difference between corporate profits and essentially retained earnings, which are used to pay out dividends, right? Retained earnings are not the same thing as corporate profits.
You keep saying dividends. Dividends are profits.
No. Okay. I use the technical term. Retained earnings, that's the money that's used to pay out dividends and to return capital to shareholders. That's not the same thing as the profits that are taxable from a corporate profit perspective. Those are different things.
Hold on. So you're saying that the dividends that a company pays out, corporate taxes don't apply at all to that?
No. So
if I own a business and I say I'm never going to withdraw anything, I'm just going to pay myself a 100% dividend from all the extra money. I don't have to pay corporate taxes on that dividend. Yeah.
So it applies to both labor and capital. So the corporate tax, because it taxes a broader base than essentially just distributions to capital, when you actually study the incidence of corporate taxation, it falls to both labor and capital. Because businesses are taxed.
When you talk about incidence of taxation, you say it falls to labor. It falls to labor such that the company might choose to pay them less, but not because there's a direct tax on the labor itself. It only falls to labor in the same way that tariffs probably are about 50-50 between the consumer and the producer, but not because the producer, China, is actually paying the tariffs, but because they're going to have to drop the price a little bit in order to remain competitive in the market. And it's like about 50-50 at the end of the day, but it doesn't mean they're paying the tariff.
Well, but just think about it conceptually.
Taxes. Sure.
So just think about it conceptually, right? So if the business has a certain amount of profits that it wants to use for investment, right? Because we're taxing corporate profits and not retained earnings, then the amount of money that the corporation has for investment goes down, right? And
let's say the corporation has $1 billion in profits, and then it wants to reinvest that $1 billion in profits into more capital. Are you saying that $1 billion in profits is facing a corporate tax rate in our current system?
So I'm sorry, say it again. I didn't understand what you're saying.
If I reinvest all my profit into my business, am I paying taxes on the profit that I reinvest into my business?
So that's one of the problems with our current tax is that we don't exempt investment activities completely, right? We have things like depreciation where you actually end up being overtaxed on what you're actually investing in, right? That was one of the things about this latest.
Now we're super nibbling around the edges at this point. I understand that there are certain classes of reinvestment that might not have the best tax treatment in a corporate tax system, but I'm saying that if I have a business and I have $1 billion in profits, I'm like, okay, I'm going to buy a whole new fleet of vans, I'm going to buy a whole new facility or whatever. Generally speaking, this money would generally be tax exempt. There might be some particular cases around.
Not generally. No,
generally that's not the case.
Depreciation. Okay, if you buy a factory, if you buy a factory and it costs $100 million, there's all these complex rules for how to depreciate that asset and actually claim the tax write-off. So Correct. If you spend $100 million in profit, or you have $100 million in profits, and you decide I'm going to buy a fucking a factory with this money, right? The government is still going to extract some of that money from you. So you're either not able to build the full amount of your factory, or you have to have more money to build the full factory because you're only able to claim say 10% of the value of that factory as a tax deduction on an annual basis. So all I'm saying, and this, retained earnings, which is my understanding is the money that's actually used to pay out dividends and return capital to shareholders, that is a smaller pot of money after you're actually already have paid your corporate tax money. The only reason we got off on this is because you described my system as similarly inefficient or similar to paying 100% corporate tax, but it's not. My system is to a pretty radical degree much more efficient. Like if you had 100% corporate tax rate, the economy would essentially be destroyed. But my system doesn't.
So I can't tell you every single thing about every depreciation schedule. I do know that in general, depreciating things over time is more beneficial than depreciating it all up front, right? That if I had $100 million of income or revenues this year, next year, the year after, I would want to depreciate on a time scale instead of depreciating all up front, because in terms of tax brackets and everything else, generally speaking is better. Well, actually, wait, I don't know if there are different corporate tax brackets, but generally spreading this out over time is helpful. I know there are some things that you can do full depreciation upfront as opposed to doing it over time, but I don't know the individual depreciation schedule.
That's my offense, right? That's my offense is that I think that your system, you're saying basically, look, I would just tax more and redistribute more. I don't necessarily care about the public wealth accumulation. I guess you did endorse the sovereign wealth fund, but it's not clear how big the sovereign wealth fund would be. But
but I also don't think, again, sovereign wealth fund, that's just a big retirement account. They're not making decisions about things. That's what
they're still collectivizing the means of production, because obviously they're buying a lot of equities with that money, right? So it's just a matter of how big the sovereign wealth fund would be. So that's why I'm saying your system is kind of like a down payment in some sense on my system. But I think that your system, by ultimately requiring a higher tax burden on society, because society isn't just getting the direct dividend payments from all these corporations, is marginally less efficient, because we have a lot of evidence. We have a lot of evidence that taxes like that are just they're not really good for your economy.
Sure. Ideally, because ideally everybody would make enough money to not need any wealth redistribution at all. I don't understand what is the okay, wait. Okay, I have one question, but before we get, I'm just trying to go back. So if there is a company, and this company is a highly profitable company compared to another company that's not as profitable, are the employees in the highly profitable company just getting a whole bunch of extra money, or are the other employees, or is all that money going to the holding company and then it's just reinvesting in another company that's holding?
I would expect my system would have a similar pay structure to today, where larger, more profitable businesses tended to pay more. That probably would happen, yeah.
Okay. And then the profits of any of those, so the extra money they make after paying out everything, Are those profits going to the holding company to invest in other companies, or is it just sitting in the bank account for potential future investment?
I'm sorry. So is the money that is the money in the treasury? What are they doing with the money that they keep in their treasuries?
Yeah.
Well, they would. So it would. Yeah. So they would do whatever they think would be most productive with it, right? So they could accumulate that money for a future investment that they want to make. They could make current investments. They could, redo their compensation structure if it's uncompetitive. They could pay down their debt. They could obviously start completely. Well, I already said they could do new investments, right? They could do acquisitions with it. So I mean, anything basically that they think would be for the best long-term, maximization of value of the business.
Okay. And then at what point do they extract value, surplus value from the company for like redistribution to the rest of society? Is it just like a flat percentage amount, or what?
Yeah, so I think that I've kind of described it as like they would have a general guidance. So for instance, when you look at the way that the Nordic companies or the Nordic countries manage their state-owned enterprises, the ones that they operate commercially, for profit, what they do is they have a basic dividend guidance. They say, hey, we want you to return, a 6% rate of return to our initial investment, which is to say some kind of loose dividend guidance that they would give. So hey, we want you to return capital such that you're either becoming 6% more valuable and you're returning, a certain amount of dividends to the company or to the country at large. And so I think that you'd have this kind of loose guidance, and then to the extent that companies kind of regularly fail to meet their guidance, there need to be some kind of explanation for why that is. But then companies would also.
I may have missed this, but now I'm kind of thinking about like, since they're talking about, I am thinking about how this distribution like gets back to the people. That is where I'm at. Because the public fund, I mean, inherently, what's the meaningful difference between someone investing in a public fund versus investing individually, right? Maybe the percentage allocation is different. Well, if you collaborate if you collaborate amongst a large public, then there is a more of an opportunity to get a larger percentage of the wealth from the company, because one person is not as big as like millions, I guess. But would people invest the same amount? Like I think I'm for a public fund. Like, why do we need socialism for a public fund? Maybe I'm missing it. Let me rewind it. Maybe he's explaining it, and then I'm just a fucking moron. Who knows?
It's helpful. I know there are some things that you can do full depreciation upfront as opposed to doing it over time, but I don't know the individual depreciation schedule.
That's my offense, right? That's my offense. Is that I think that your system, you're saying basically, look, I would just tax more and redistribute more. I don't necessarily care about like the public wealth accumulation. I guess you did endorse the sovereign wealth fund, but it's not clear like how big the sovereign wealth fund would be. But
but I also don't think, again, sovereign wealth fund, that's just a big retirement account. They're not making decisions about things. That's what I.
Well, they're still collectivizing like the means of production, because obviously they're buying a lot of equities with that money, right? So it's just a matter of how big the sovereign wealth fund would be. So that's why I'm saying your system is kind of like a down payment in some sense on my system. But I think that your system, by ultimately requiring a higher tax burden on society, because society isn't just getting the direct dividend payments from all these corporations, is marginally less efficient, because we have a lot of evidence. We have a lot of evidence that taxes like that are just they're not really good for your economy.
Sure. I mean, ideally. Because ideally, everybody would make enough money to not need any wealth redistribution at all. I don't understand, what is the okay, wait. Okay, I have one question before we get. I'm just trying to go back. So if there is a company, and this company is a highly profitable company compared to another company that's not as profitable, are the employees in the highly profitable company just getting a whole bunch of extra money, or are the other employees, or is all that money going to the holding company and then it's just reinvesting in other companies that's holding?
I would expect my system would have a similar pay structure to today, where larger, more profitable businesses tended to pay more. That probably would happen, yeah.
Okay. And then the profits of any of those, so the extra money they make after paying out everything, are those profits going to the holding company to invest in other companies, or is it just sitting in the bank account for potential future investment?
I'm sorry. So is the money that is the money in the treasury? What are they doing with the money that they keep in their treasuries?
Yeah.
Well, they would do whatever they think would be most productive with it, right? So they could accumulate that money for a future investment that they want to make. They could make current investments. They could, redo their compensation structure if it's uncompetitive. They could pay down their debt. They could obviously start.
I don't really see how that's very different from like passive investing, but maybe there is an inherent difference. But I am curious in terms of the meaningful difference between investing. There might be something that I'm missing. I'm trying to publicly owned versus privately owned. I know that's a meaningful difference. The way you can publicly own is with a sovereign fund. Okay. Because
I already said they could do new investments, right? They could do acquisitions with it. So I mean, anything basically that they think would be for the best long-term, maximization of value of the business.
Okay, and then at what point did they extract?
So BlackRock is a public company, and if you didn't know about BlackRock, it's an investment company that they own a lot of shares of like some of the biggest corporations in the world. Everybody could just invest into BlackRock. So that's why I'm thinking about what Econoboi is saying. It sounds like you're giving more power to like a BlackRock inherently, right? I might have missed. There might have been something I missed in terms of the innate difference. The U.S. military is preparing to deploy hundreds of Washington Guard troops to. Wait, what? To D.C. You're about to send the National Guard to D.C. Why? Bro, I don't. Trump just be doing shit, bro. I swear to God.
Value, surplus value from the company for like redistribution to the rest of society? Is that just like a flat percentage amount or what?
Yeah, so I think that, so I've kind of described it as like they would have a general guidance. So for instance, when you look at the way that the Nordic companies or the Nordic countries manage their state-owned enterprises, the ones that they operate commercially, for profit, what they do is they have a basic dividend guidance. They say, hey, we want you to return, a 6% rate of return to our initial investment, which is to say some kind of loose dividend guidance that they would give. So, hey, we want you to return capital such that you're either becoming 6% more valuable and you're returning, a certain amount of dividends to the company or to the country at large. And so I think that you'd have this kind of loose guidance. And then to the extent that companies kind of regularly fail to meet their guidance, there need to be some kind of explanation for why that is. But then companies would also, you'd also probably have some incentives for paying extraordinary amount of dividends. Again, you'd have like performance pay and things like that as well.
Okay, so there's more of a public pressure for these for the company to adhere to the guidance or the rules that they put in place. Okay, and that would be something like putting more of an investment into like welfare programs and social programs and just like stuff for the state. Okay. How do you enforce it? Would be the next question, right? Like, how do you force BlackRock to do this, for example? And like, how do you force BlackRock to create a board? Okay, I'm allow them if they. I'm sure they're. We'll see if they come up with these questions, and if they get there, then I will add my points to that.
Okay, so then just curious, because my next question goes into what you kind of just said. So, what other country are you looking at for guidance here? You talked about the 6% return. Who are you talking about? Is that Norway?
I think this was a Swedish report, their state ownership report from 2022, if I'm not mistaken.
Okay, and then like what percentage of firms are owned by the state? Are we talking about like competitive firms that sell goods and services in non-monopolistic markets? So we're not just talking about like energy corporations and stuff, right?
No, yeah. So Sweden has a mixture of a bunch of different state-owned enterprises. They're not doing exactly what I'm describing. I was just using there as an example of how they would manage essentially extraction of profits from these companies. But what Sweden does is they have a bunch of different state-owned companies. They separate these companies into two buckets. One is commercial. One is like essentially commercial plus, where you have commercial enterprises that are meant to essentially just maximize profits, and then you have commercial enterprises that have other social goals. An example of each would be like one enterprise. I'll use Norway as an example because I'm more familiar. Like Equinor would be an example of a purely commercial enterprise. There's no social goals associated with Equinor. But Norway also has a state ownership company which is based around essentially creating art. It's like, hey, we put on plays and we put on art galleries and stuff like that. Like we have a balance sheet and we have like a profit and loss statement, but we're not like really expected to make money. This is almost more of like a social service with transparent accounting. That's how they do it.
Okay, wait. Okay, so I'm just curious. So I look up Sweden, and it looks like Sweden literally has like 43 enterprises that they own, and like 60% of the portfolio value is in energy related stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Right.
So is Norway closer to what you were talking about, or
you're saying, oh, you're just looking for examples of my system?
Or yeah, like the closest thing, like what directionally? Because you keep saying saying that your system is more efficient, and I don't know how you say that with no evidence. But then you're like,
yeah, sorry.
Yeah,
I think in terms of an institutional framework, Norway and Singapore are the closest.
Okay, and then what part of Norway are we looking towards here?
What part of Norway? Like their sovereign wealth fund and their state-owned enterprises and their government.
Okay, but for Norway, isn't their sovereign wealth fund like over 60% invested in like other capitalist economies with capitalist firms and capitalist frameworks?
Yeah, so again, my ideal system would still have a stock market, and you'd still have liquid markets for things, right, that you could monitor. So it's not in contradiction to my system. I would say another thing is that one of the reasons why
how can you have a stock market? Why would I ever buy a stock?
Well, so you might buy a stock because you're a sole proprietor retail investor, but then obviously the holding corporations and the different capital managers would also want to buy stocks on a liquid market because it's
no. I understand why they would want to buy stocks because they're redistributing the profits to the end of the day back to the state. But why would as an individual, can I buy stocks in a company?
Yeah, so like I said, I think you probably have some system for like individual retail ownership. I mean, to the extent that that's offensive to the socialists because there's some like, I guess technically you're an equity owner, right? Then you could always just say, okay, well, we're only going to do things with these private holding corporations. But that's kind of beside the point. The point is,
that's not technically. That is the point, right? Is you're part of the ownership class when you have stock in a company.
Okay,
so
that's my only point.
Okay,
my only.
Yeah, I guess the biggest concern if someone becomes like an expert in, because that's how you accumulate wealth, like the growth potential of like different stocks, and you're trying to prevent billionaires. But let's say someone is an expert in this and they look for specific corporations and businesses where they can invest in the stock and they are able to maximize the growth potential of the stocks that they hold, and they are able to acquire a lot of wealth from that. How do you check that person if they're an individual? They are not beholden to the holding companies. So do you take his money? How do you take his money? Like, okay, yeah, I think this is the line of questioning Destiny's going under. So we'll see if
my only point is that you would still have a stock market. You'd still be incentivized to list public shares because that's a way to raise capital on a public market, right? So I mean, there'd still be like a liquid financialization of assets in my market. The only reason I brought up the stock market was because.
But why would you? No, this doesn't make any sense because you're saying that you would go to these technocratic boards in order to get financing. Why would you also have to raise money from individuals as well who aren't even allowed to have significant ownership? Because, like you said, you can hire employees and stuff in your economy. I don't understand how you could be like a stock owner.
Well, right now in our system, you can go to like wealthy investors and just get like private capital investment, but then there's also an incentive to like go public with your company because there's certain advantages related to going public. The main advantage being that although it does come with additional responsibilities, the main advantage being that you have easier access to capital if you wanted to like list shares in the future. And so the same incentive would exist in my current system or in my.
No, hold on, you can't keep saying the same incentive. It doesn't make any sense. You just started that off with a company that goes public. That's after you've already gotten a large initial investment from another owner class person. These people will be eliminated in your society. They don't exist anymore. You cannot have an individual that is capitalizing a business. All businesses initially must be capitalized by your holding companies.
So they would be capitalized by the holding corporations, but again, you'd still be incentivized to go public. Because I'll just use one example. Let's say that you have a company, you're going to start a shoe company. Hey guys, I want money to start this shoe company, right? It's like, okay, sweet. You seem like a good guy. We're going to give you $5 million to start the shoe company. Let's just say it explodes in value. Oh shit, now it's worth $100 million, and we want to now go public. So now it's essentially entirely owned by the holding corporation as a private entity. It's not publicly traded, right? But now it's like, okay, well, fuck, it's worth $100 million. And this holding corporation says, you know what, we want to list these shares and kind of have these other holding corporations buy us out because this has been such a good investment for us. And we have these other things that we want to invest in. We either want to pay down our debt. Sorry, what were you saying?
No? If the holding company wants to go public, but the CEO or whatever doesn't want to, who wins that fight?
Well, I think board members would be a mixture of the state in the form of the holding corporations themselves and the workers at each individual firm. So if the workers at the firm and also the holding corporation appointees decided, hey, this is a good idea, like they would just have a vote and a discussion, and that's how that decision would go forward. And they would be the same people that would ultimately. Yeah,
okay. I don't know why.
I was just going to say that.
Go ahead.
You would vote to go public because the holding corporation might say, hey, this has been a really profitable private investment for us, but we think that we can allocate a lot of this money more efficiently if we're able to extract out and be able to be bought out from part of our ownership. Same reason why people go public today. Hey, we want to either make a lot of money and use that money for some other purpose. In the case of a rich investor, it's like we might use that money just to consume it, might use it to start another company. And the same thing, the holding corporation would have the exact same incentive. Hey, we think that we could list our shares.
The exact same incentive.
That's it. You keep not understanding what I'm saying.
I do understand.
The holding corporation.
When you go public, the reason why you're going public is because you have a failure to access a lot of capital. But But in your system, you've got these capitalized holding firms that already have access to theoretically infinite capital or close to infinite capital. You're talking about going public to
that's completely that's an incomplete understanding of why corporations go public. They don't go public just because they want to access more capital. The process of going public is buying out current investors, right? Buying out current investors. You're not listing new shares on the secondary market. That money doesn't go to the corporation. It goes to current owners, right? And so when a holding corporation
says, definitionally, when you go public, it gives you the ability to issue shares to additional owners. I believe it's 500. I think is the limit for a C corp before you're. Or no, actually, I'm C corp. But wait, you're saying if you don't go public to raise more capital, what do you go public for? What's the point of going public?
Okay. We've got the shoe company. It's privately owned.
No, wait, just right now today. What is the point of going public for a corporation? You said I don't understand it. I thought the reason why you go public is because you want to raise additional funds, especially from the public market. You don't have to sell like all of your equity to one person. What's the point of going public?
It's both, right? You can raise more shares or I guess you can raise more shares essentially and have some of that be like retained for the corporation. But a big reason why a lot of companies go public is just because current owners want to be bought out and they want to either use that money for some lavish consumption or they want to reinvest in other ventures. And so a holding
current owners want to be bought out. So that's why they go public. Why can't they be bought out as a private entity? Unless they're talking about being bought out. Who's buying them out? Because I'm trying to compare it to like my knowledge of like, buying an NBA team, right? NBA franchise. The reason why a lot of people buy these things is because so it can grow in value. Most of these people don't give a two shits to whether or not the team is good. Like most of them don't even understand the sport that they're investing in. So they buy it. Like recent one, Mark Cuban bought the Mavericks. And then a couple of years later, after they won a championship and all that stuff, it increased in value by a lot. And then he sold his share. So why exactly does it need to be public to do that? Because all you have to do is need to find a private entity, an investor to buy it from, or unless you can't buy it if it's private. I don't know.
Corporation might say, hey, look, this is our we're the only holding corporation that owns this company and it's really profitable, but we think that either this corporation needs broader access to capital because our balance sheet can't handle it, or we want to make a shitload of money and get our performance pay.
Okay, I understand. Help me here, okay? I understand what you're saying, okay? But part of the going public is being listed on exchanges, having broad access to a whole bunch of different investors. But in your world, we already have all these holding firms that are able to look at all these other things. Like, for instance, if you do a startup business, your goal to make money, to get bought out, isn't to go public. Your goal is to sell to a larger business, right? So I just don't understand in your world why, like, other firms can always buy percentage shares of some company. They don't have to go public for other people to buy equity in the company. Like, I just don't think going public would ever happen because every firm can see the entire market anyway. They would have access to all of this information regardless. They're like, I don't know why no company would ever go public. Everything's basically already public anyway, I think.
So no, because the shares aren't actually listed and open for liquid sale, right? Like that's the big difference between private and public. Is like it's much easier to list shares in the future if you want to raise additional capital, but then it's also much easier for your shares to be bought out because it's a way bigger pool of people that are interested in your shares.
There's one more clarifying question then.
So open for sale is the difference, is the exposure for sale. Okay.
So when you're starting a business in your model, when you start that business, the holding firm has 100% of the shares of your company and nobody else can buy or sell or trade shares? Because I thought before you were saying that people could buy percentages of companies. Is that only...
Well, right, but those would be the companies that are publicly traded, right? So you'd still have privately traded businesses. So that's why I mentioned joint ventures earlier as well, that you might have a situation where two holding corporations say, hey, we want to do this joint venture together and we just own it 50-50, or maybe it would just be, like you said, just 100% owned by one holding corporation, because again, private companies, like you said, sometimes do have diverse capital stacks, but a lot of the times those private companies are just 100% owned by, single people.
Okay, all right.
Yeah, and so again, I just think...
Nordic, you said the Nordic model is the next... is the thing that you like the most. But I feel like you point to the sovereign wealth fund a lot, but I feel like the sovereign wealth fund is literally just investments into other capitalist economies and firms in capitalist economies.
That does bring up a question, just real quick for you, Econoboi. How would this system work with other countries? Like, would a holding company be allowed to invest in a country with a different economic model and do things with that? Like, how would they interact? What would the interaction look like?
Yeah. I mean, I think foreign investments and foreign direct investment would be things in my system, right? So to the extent that the holding corporations thought that it would be, a value proposition to do, entrepreneurial activity outside of the country, they could do that. And to the extent that a foreign company wanted to, I guess to some degree, if you wanted to enter into, like, say, a joint partnership with like a foreign company because you thought that it would be, substantially more efficient, you could do that as well.
I want to pay really low wages in China to make my sneakers, right?
Yeah, Wick, hey, if you're criticizing my system because of
I'm asking a
trade,
question.
then I've got some bad news about capitalism, right? So
Okay.
again, our current system would have
foreign
markets and
Sure.
allocation,
And if you
right?
think that's bad, how does your system improve it?
So my system, this is one of the criticisms of social democrats in general is that we don't have an internationalist model. That my system, to the extent that we can improve things like foreign trade relations and climbing the value chain in other countries, that's a fiscal problem. What would the government do to try and do that? But I don't know that there's a clean way to really accomplish that from a pre-distributive side from the companies in in the public wealth's portfolio. So my system doesn't really. I mean, to the extent that my system raises a lot more money for the government, in theory we could have more foreign aid and things like that with other countries. But that's been one of the criticisms for basically any non-internationalist socialist model. I don't have a good way to, other than just basically saying all the other countries should do the same thing that I'm describing. But our current system is pretty terrible in that regard as well.
And
sorry, yeah.
One more question from my end. If the workers in a company who obviously, well, I guess I'll just ask the workers in a company, say a company started, the workers have the board or whatever the company has say in how that company is run. Is that correct? Right? Say the holding company,
boards,
the holding company disagrees with the company, right? So the holding corporation that invests in the company and things like that, they have a disagreement with the workers or the board of that company. Who wins that fight, right?
Obviously, the boards of the corporations within the holding company would be appointed by the holding company, so you can't really have like disagreement between these boards, right? I mean, it'd be like saying what if the shareholders disagreed with the board of Amazon? It's like, well, they would just kick out the board. And
I think he was saying the shareholders disagree with the employees.
Yes, the employees, the workers of the company. I work for the shoe company under this holding employee. We've gotten together and we say, you know what? We're not being compensated enough for what we did. This percentage that the holding company is giving us, it's just not enough. We want more.
Yeah, well, my system would have essentially a tripartite structure of unionization and like worker board management, right? So if the workers were really pissed off about how the holding corporation was treating them, they could go.
I guess something that I thought about is like the potential influence of a foreign entity and foreign investments to ruin or shift the economy of this country. There would have to be heavy restrictions on that, which would also require a lot more governmental control. In order for this to work, at the end of the day, there needs to be a lot of governmental control. There just needs to be. And I think Econoboi obviously knows if more governmental control is afforded, that's how we're going to lead into an authoritarian regime. Because some of the enforcement principles and the potential inclusion and involvement, and then the people's interests, like there's so many aspects where there can be a lot of potential negative actors
on strike.
Okay.
Yeah. So, I mean, I believe in union, again, like my system, I think it's important to have things like unions and stuff like that, but, that's independent of my system. You can have, and many countries do have publicly owned corporations that are still union. Like we have the USPS and they have a separate union, even though it's socially owned. And so my system would do the same thing. To the point, Destiny, that you made about Norway and its sovereign wealth fund is
hold on, I'm sorry. You keep saying the same thing as triggers. I'm so sorry.
Going on okay, you can go on strike. It also that also plays into my idea of like there could be an incentive to conglomerate one holding company for people to maximize benefits, and like that is something.
The reason why the postal system, I guess, probably has a union is because there's a sole. It's a one owner market. It's a monopoly, right? The United States of America or the U.S. Postal Service is the sole employer of like U.S. Postal Service workers. You kind of need a union there because you have no negotiating power otherwise. But in your world, you would have multiple holding firms that are all competing against each other. So the necessity for a union isn't necessarily the same strength as you need one against a single state-owned thing, right?
Well, there's a lot of public employees that aren't represented by a union, and there's a lot of private employees that are and are not. This kind of matrix includes, all of those different possibilities. I'm just saying that the question of like essentially how do we empower workers in my system is a similar struggle that we see today. That like we need to have a system of unionization and kind of like worker board membership in an ideal sense to try and represent the interests of both the society that controls ultimately all these corporations, but then also the workers themselves who want to have good standards of living and not be miserable.
Sure.
Yeah. And so anyway, to address your point about Norway, so they're sovereign. They do have two sovereign wealth funds. One of their sovereign wealth funds is invest domestically. One is invest in foreign companies. The foreign one is, I think it's like 5 or 6 times as big as the one that's invested domestically. And there's 2 main reasons why it's invested in foreign companies. One of the reasons is that, number one, Norway is just a hugely oil-rich country, right? So they literally they want to diversify away from their economy, because not doing so would be like terrible for their economy because they're so oil dependent. And the second reason is that their domestic liquid capital market is really quite small, because they essentially have more oil wealth than they have like private capital accumulation in some sense, right? And so they kind of have to invest in like other liquid markets. The Oslo Stock Exchange, I think, in a given year is something like 30 or 40% owned by the domestic sovereign wealth fund. So the United States, by having such a huge amount of liquid wealth already domestically, I did a calculation based on a huge data set that I pulled. It was something like 20% of GDP is produced by just all of the different 4,000 publicly traded corporations. All those corporations are publicly traded, so in theory, they're very easily to socialize, right? You just buy out the shares. And so the United States actually has kind of a unique advantage relative to Norway when it comes to utilizing a sovereign wealth fund to socialize the means of production.
But we have no guarantee that it would function anywhere similarly to the Norwegian sovereign wealth fund, though, right?
Well,
because
at least the sovereign wealth fund would, right? Because even
no, because the sovereign, but I don't talk about buying out all the companies, right? The Norwegian sovereign wealth fund probably owns very small stakes in everything that it invests in internationally, that are all capitalist economies that it's all deriving most of its money from. You're talking about the United States buying wholesale or 50% plus ownership, controlling shares in all of their domestic companies. There's no reason to assume that the returns on the profits or whatever there would be as beneficial as the returns on the Norwegian social wealth fund profits.
Well, yeah, but again, so the holding corporations and the sovereign wealth funds themselves would be competing against each other. So they would still have, they'd still have like kind of minority ownership, and they'd be, selling and buying these shares in a competitive process. So I think that we would still be able to have what you're describing, like not necessarily like single entity controlling shares. It's just when you accumulate all the public ownership, it ends up being controlling shares, but it's still like a competitive process of distributed board appointments and, technocratic management, which I think is really, really important to maintain. And again, I think that and I guess we might be circling the drain here, but I think that my system is superior to yours because my system, number one, and I think directly addresses the problem of what private wealth accumulation. And your system, by relying on tax revenue, I think relies on, by the literature that I'm familiar with, a less efficient means to socialize the returns to capital, and certainly
just to be clear, we both rely on the exact same mechanisms, right?
So again, I don't think that my system is equivalent to a corporate tax. But
wait. If you're a janitor and you're working in your system, where are you getting all of your money from?
Where you work.
How is that place generating that much money?
To pay a janitor?
Janitors are not making the same amount as like an engineer. If you're like working at think of whatever the poorest fast food worker, the poorest compensation job.
Well, yeah, I mean, obviously, so janitors don't work at like the janitor company, right? So like there are cleaning services companies, right? But I mean, a lot of janitors are employed by corporations directly, and so you'd have a similar diverse structure for how employees are hired and like what kind of employees are getting hired at certain.
Sure, but then let's say it's for a small restaurant. Where are the janitors in that company, or in the small restaurant company? Where are those people getting the majority? They would need to get a lot of money from the state, right?
Well, they would be hired either from the balance sheet of, or the cash flow operations of the restaurant itself. Right, so they would either hire janitors directly, or they would contract out that service to like a cleaning company.
The janitors in that society, in your society, would have to be getting all of the profit like distribution from also like the giant Amazons of your society as well. It relies on some tax mechanism and some social redistribution.
They would be, so what you do with the dividends is just a question for your fiscal state. So you're right. So you could just directly give everyone a check. If I think
you keep using these terms to hand wave away what I'm saying. You say you said that your system directly addresses like income inequality, or directly addresses distribution of wealth, and I said that no, we rely on the same mechanisms. And then you just said, well, that's a question for the fiscal state. That's the fiscal state is what deals with wealth redistribution through taxation.
Okay. So in my system, 100% of capital income, like in an ideal system, obviously, 100% of capital income is socialized. In your system, maybe you can raise the capital gains tax to 60%, but that's going to fucking like destroy the economy, right? Like we know that capital gains taxes are bad for investment allocation. They're bad for investment distribution, right? Like it disincentivizes investment. So
I agree.
That's what
but in your system, we have no idea if your system works at all, to be fair, okay? Because you can't say that, well, in your system it would work perfectly, but in mine it would destroy. We have no idea how your system
works. We know
works.
60-70% capital gains taxes don't work, right? So I mean, I think that my system, maybe would have a shot of working.
You don't know if your system can even maintain a functional society.
But yeah, I mean that's the biggest thing. You can't claim your system is this like better because of a hypothetical scenario that has no practical implementation. That doesn't make sense, like at all. I'm not gonna lie, and I'll be honest. If I was Destiny, I would start getting pissed off too. It's like, we know my system is better than your system. I'm like, bro, we don't know if your fucking system will work. Stop saying that. That would actually piss me off if you kept on saying that. I'm not gonna lie.
So I don't think that's fair to say that we can just assume that. But I'm just saying that in your system, for Well, you have no example of it, so you can't possibly.
Well, hold on. We have a system. Well, no, because we have even like really bad socialist systems, like the USSR, for instance, right? A terrible, awful socialist system. They had a functioning society, right? Like it wasn't like the whole entire society collapsed, right?
Because that's the USSR collapsed.
Hey, wait, is that funny?
The Soviet Union literally did collapse. Okay, so I
That's
don't know why that would be an example.
No, the Soviet Union did collapse because again, that was a shit socialist system. I've already said it's terrible, right? But again, to say like we don't even know if your system would even like society might collapse if your system happened. There's so many substantial reasons to think that my system would work much better than the USSR, and the USSR for 100 years had like a country and a government, and they had services and things like that. Obviously, it was a terrible fucking country,
like 60 years.
Yeah, it wasn't 100.
What was it? It was like the 1970s.
But like the fact that you have to use that as a comparison is the problem. Like, imagine someone thinks of like an ideal version of like Christian nationalism or Nazism, right? Like it would sound insane. Like my system is better than that system that persecuted all the Jews or persecuted everybody that's not a Christian. Like it's like, I mean, the only litmus test, the only example, the only situation that I can kind of compare it to is a system that failed and persecuted and killed millions of people. Like I don't know what you want me to do here. Do I just go blind faith? That's what it requires.
Revolution all the way to the 90s. So I mean, that's like
to 90, 91.
Yeah, about 70, 80?
80 years, not 100. Okay, whatever.
We'll say about 70 years. But okay, I'm just saying that back to the directly addressed thing, right? In your ideal world, the people at the Amazon Corporation would be making way more than the people at the Pancake House Corporation. You would have to find a way to get the.
Do you at least concede the point that we can't rate? We cannot literally have a 100% capital gains tax. We can't have a 100% wealth tax. That your system, you keep saying that your system. No,
I wouldn't want to tax that way. I don't know. I wouldn't want to tax. I wouldn't tax. I agree that would be horrible. I think corporate tax should be zero in the United States. I think
so we don't have. So that's in my view, that's a distinct advantage of my system is that it's much more egalitarian. You couldn't get the egalitarianism of my system under your system because your system.
I'm just saying that the egalitarian
upper limits of a tax.
Well, but we can't talk about any of the upper limits of your system because it's highly theoretical. But I'm just saying that you still need a government entity to reallocate money from one business to the employees of another business. Now, my system does it with taxation. You might have a different name for it in your system, but in your system, the guy that works at the Pancake House versus the guy that works in Amazon's AWS cluster, the excess profit that he generates has to go to that Pancake House employee at some point. You can call it whatever you want, but at some point it has to be redistributed back from fiscally.
So that's what I've said. So you interrupted my explanation, but I thought I was directly answering it. The reason I said it's a fiscal decision is because you could do substantially anything with that money, right? So I mean, you could do a UBI. Let's just say that you do a UBI. Okay, so all the capital income, I think it's something like $4 or $5 trillion a year, is kind of like evenly distributed amongst all people, all adults. That's about $1,500.
UBI, unlimited base income or something base income. Universal base income, something like that.
$100 a month, right? I mean, that's not like an amount of money that.
I agree with you. I think you could do it, but at that point, it's not intrinsic to your system if you're using a UBI. That's the same thing as me doing welfare, right?
So yeah, that's what I'm saying. You could tax and spend such that you get a $1,500 a month UBI. But what I'm saying is that the taxes that you would rely on would be much more detrimental to the economy than my system of socialization of capital. And obviously you disagree, but I mean that's my point. I think my system's more economically efficient.
I wanna start. We are circling the drain so much, but I do have a couple questions.
All right.
For you guys.
Hit us with the chat questions,
right?
Hey, callers, why not?
For a little bit, but Econoboi,
oh
I guess,
man,
yes.
I wish I had time to join some of these panels. I just don't. I'm too busy building my own stuff and like my own like panel conversation thing that I eventually want to do. But I wish I had time because I wish I had time. Basically, I wish I had time to do more panels. I just don't.
I'm going to ask you. You mentioned banks earlier, right? Like, oh, they'll just get like loans for the banks and things like that. Do banks exist in your system as private entities?
Banks would exist as, entities owned by the public holding corporations.
Okay. Fair enough. So what is, in your opinion, so I'm going to ask the opposite question, Destiny, but for you, what ways is capitalism better, right? What pros does capitalism have that you would have to see that your system, well, we just can't handle this as much, but I think my system is better overall, but here, and here, I think capitalism does better. And I'm going to ask the opposite question to Destiny in a minute. Go ahead.
I'm a little confused. You're asking me to say what are the best things about capitalism?
Steelman capitalism for me. And I'm going to ask him to steelman socialism. Okay.
Yeah, I think the best argument against my system from a socialist perspective is that, like I said, it's not very internationalist in nature. It doesn't necessarily address between country inequality as well, other than those countries just adopting the same system that I'm advocating for. But that's a little bit harder. It's hard for me to say that the Mexicans should do one thing and the Canadians should do another thing. So that's probably one left-wing criticism of my system. In terms of capitalist criticisms of my system, or like steelman capitalism from a more centrist perspective, I would say that one of the arguably most fundamental problems with my system is that you do require a very, very ideal institutional framework. That it's very sensible to say, well, Econoboi, look at all these examples, right? Like this book, The Public Wealth of Nations, right? It's not all like jerking off examples of public wealth. There's a whole chapter of that book dedicated to failed public wealth experiments, because governments oftentimes run public wealth into the fucking ground. And so it's totally fair to say, by my system being so state reliant, that I'm essentially requiring a kind of a perfect state or kind of an ideal set of circumstances for it to run well. I happen to think that it's possible or probable that we could do that, but that's a big disadvantage of my system relative to a distributed system of private ownership.
Okay, same question.
Oh, I'm glad he recognizes that. I don't think it's possible, but I'm glad he recognizes that.
Destiny. Econoboi socialism, or socialism with Econoboi characteristics, if you want to call it that.
That's what I like to call it.
From what you've heard, is probably the ways that you could find, if any, that it outperforms the current capitalist model.
I think one of the biggest issues that I think we're facing today, to quote the wise economist Gary's economics, but I think that capital is conferring massive advantages onto capital owners, and I think there's a massive gulf growing between those that own capital and those that don't. And I think that finding a way to bring like wealth accrued via capital ownership into a more state-owned and state-distributed enterprise, I mean, theoretically, if you could find a way to integrate that more with market forces or integrate that more economically, that's probably a superior way, like both politically and everything else, than integrating it with like tax policy. Like if you have a corporation where, if we could imagine we could just like print 50 years of history right away and people start someplace. If you have a cooperatively owned corporation and it just is that the CEO owns 10 times more than the bottom employee, and that's the most it ever is, then that's a norm that carries forward into the future, probably requires less intervention from the government to make things fair between the lowest paid employee and the highest paid employee, because that's just like a norm that would hopefully develop and stay in place over time. Whereas if you have the norms that we have today, and it's the thing, you don't have to fight as much for policy, for welfare, for UBI, whatever bullshit. Those conversations are hopefully just not as much what we talk about politically. Whereas in our system today, we have massive fights over redistribution of wealth. And in my opinion, people have a very fucked concept of where does wealth in this country come from, because people very much look at the top of the pyramid and they assume that the block is floating there rather than all of the piles of stuff that are beneath that help to support that structure. So in my opinion, like the greatest advantage to more cooperatively owned economies or socially owned economies is that there's so much more economic integration. You can eliminate a lot of these very lame, very morally loaded fiscal questions about how does the government steal money from rich people and give it back to poor people, because in a more socially owned economy, you can kind of see like, oh, actually everybody is required to make this business work. If that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. Fair enough. Okay, gang, if you want to ask either of these lovely individuals some questions, if you have comments that you want to share, just jump backstage. We'll take a little bit of callers. It won't be too long, and then we'll wrap it up and we'll close out for the evening. I gotta say, I have more questions than I have answers, but that's probably limited to the format and the fact that we've gone for 2 hours, and it's a whole ass economic system. So I don't think it's entirely fair to ask you to like answer every single question and all these things. But fair enough. Let's bring on some of these individuals and
let's do it.
See what happens.
I wish they explored the value. I mean, this is two things I wish they explored. Is like, why can't we just do what you did in an altered version under a capitalist system? Considering that, like, you use the Scandinavian countries like Norway and Sweden as an example, but they are also free market capitalist systems, or like a mixed economy or something like that. So why don't you just advocate for that and not call yourself a socialist, but instead just say, I believe in certain principles that are socialist adjacent. I just think the label is just ineffective in political discourse. But whatever.
You're live. Hello. Welcome.
Hello.
Hi. What you got for us?
Hello.
I want to ask Econoboi about his like morals and ideology, because he's said before that he's described himself as a liberal socialist, or at least that his socialism is compatible with liberalism. From everything I've read, liberalism, one of the core tenets of liberalism is private enterprise and private.
I'm gonna end it here. I've been fucking making this video for 3 hours, so that is all we got. There's some interesting things here. There's some things that I wish they tackled a little bit more directly in terms of how the ideal can break down that he was referring to. But there's also requires a lot. Like I was able to like understand certain concepts based off how they explained it in the midst of the conversation, which is why I think these are valuable. For me, I'm able to kind of piece information together very effectively without needing to kind of research everything. But there's certain terms that I'm just not familiar with, and I just have to Google. It's not too hard. But ultimately, I think this was an interesting conversation. But after this, I think Econoboi said he's done with online politics. So, should we look at comments? I think the fatal flaw of Econoboi's model is the assumption that ownership structure has no effect on the success and function of companies. I think I talked about that, right? Did I bring that up? Oh, consumerism. I talked about how it would affect consumerism. As a union rep, it's nearly impossible to get people to show up for a single meeting once a month. I can't imagine trying to run a business where everyone has an equal say. That's something that I wish they entertain as well. This one says not public ownership, it's government ownership. You don't own the police force. The police don't answer to you. You don't make decisions about the police. The government does all that. The most you could do is vote for someone that claims they'll do something you like, but even that person does get into the government, they'll not be able to do what you want. That's another aspect of it in terms of the efficacy of like a board, whether or not the board attributes to the people's needs. Does the board have more ownership stake? Does the board require vote approval? Like there's things there. Providing space for open conversation, the unsung hero of every one of these episodes. Shout out Wick TV. His description won't be his channel won't be in my description because I fuck with Wick. I just wish I could have more time to appear on these things, but I just don't. What's weird is that Econoboi believes that the economy would just operate under this approach as it does today relative to creating via economic creativity, but we know that preferred approach relying on technocrats does not work very well at all. Read a couple more. I think it's supposed to do what they do because they just love doing what they do is a take. I do think there's an element there, so that's why I said I agree with Econoboi. Not that they do because they love it, but they do because that's a huge incentive on the initial process, and they also want to benefit monetarily. So if you are able to just provide them with the wealth or the funds, the cash, then that could satiate their wants, right? Their need, or I guess 80% of new businesses failed in our current system. Those costs are not socialized. In the Econoboi system, those losses would be borne by the taxpayer. Could we see more fruitful companies? Well, you would assume that more. I also have to like. Oh, there's so much to that I just don't want to address right now. Early in Econoboi admits that governments are very bad at keeping track of their own assets, so we should give those governments 70% of the nation's capital. Yeah, I brought that up in the video as well. Think that goose that lays golden eggs will still be laying them after it's killed and cooked. Now, this is the biggest thing. Like, I feel like his ideas can work under a capitalist system. So I just don't know why he wants it to be socialism. Like, there's something there. There's a disconnect that I have with Econoboi. I do think Econoboi has good intent, though. I might watch the rest of it on my own time and just see like the rest of what is said, maybe. Like on my little watch later. Yeah. But that's all we got. Hope you guys enjoyed. With that said, y'all have a good one. Take care and peace.